He had woken in worse places than this, a ditch outside Antioch, the mud frozen to the wool of his cloak, and 3 dead men he did not know pressed against his legs for warmth they could no longer give. A granary in Judea that had recently held grain and recently held fire, the smoke still curling from the crossbeams, while his sentry slept in shifts on the blackened floor because it was the only structure left standing in the village. A ship moving through black nothing towards stars he had no names for, seated in a chair that was not designed for a human spine, surrounded by people who shared no common tongue with him, breathing air that tasted faintly of metal and something sweetly chemical he had decided 3 days ago was either medicine or poison, and had stopped caring which. The list was longer than he had expected. Quintus Sertorius Corvus opened his eyes and did not move. This was training. The body wakes before the mind admits it, and the interval between is the most dangerous moment of any watch. You use it, you listen, you catalog. You do not announce yourself until you know what you are announcing yourself to. The bridge hummed. He had been listening to that hum for how long? 8 days. 8 days since the cell, since the corridor, since the holding bay where he had counted 31 frightened people and turned them into 3 groups and given each group a task and watched the fear in their eyes become something shaped. 8 days and the hum had changed 3 times. The first day it had been erratic, a stutter in the lower registers that he felt more in his chest than heard. By the 3rd day it had steadied to a constant throb that reminded him of a mill wheel turning in a good current. Now it was smoother still, almost tonal, and he had decided, without evidence, without understanding, without any expertise in whatever arcane principle drove this vessel, that it sounded like a healthy thing. He did not know if he was right. He failed the uncertainty and acted. Numb, his eyes tracked to the bridge without turning his head. The navigation station, the tracker, Pakla, the one who read corridors the way a scout reads ridgelines, was still there. She had not slept. Her posture said she did not intend to. Her hands rested on either side of the glowing display, hovering above it, reading it the way a hunter reads sign from 3 paces back. Whatever she saw in those moving lights, she trusted her reading of it enough to be still. The engineering console, 1 station to the right, Decca, asleep. Her head was pillowed on her left forearm, her right hand still resting on the console surface, near the sequence of symbols she had keyed in at some ungodly hour. The orange glow of the display cast her face in sodium light. She had not stirred since he checked his internal count 4 hours ago, when she had typed something into a field, whispered a word he didn't catch, and let the exhaustion take her between one breath and the next. She was the youngest of them. She was also the only one who could read this ship's language, and she had stayed awake the longest to prove it. He would not wake her yet. The door Sevhel. The Norseman had claimed the position the way a dog claims a doorway, by being there every time anyone looked. He stood with his shoulders against the frame, arms crossed, head tilted at the angle that meant he was listening to the corridor beyond. He had not slept. Quintus doubted he intended to until someone physically dragged him from the post, and even then the dragging would be eventful. Sevhel caught Quintus's eyes. A nod. Nothing has changed. The corridor is quiet. Quintus returned it. Good, stay. The entire exchange took less than a breath. Neither man spoke the other's language. Neither needed to. 2 soldiers, separated by 8 centuries of history and every possible difference of culture, recognizing the universal grammar of a sentry report. The central bridge platform, Tigo. The Mexica warrior sat cross-legged on the floor near the main display column, his back straight, his eyes open but focused on something in the middle distance that Quintus suspected was not the bridge. He had eaten 1 nutrient slab 3 hours ago. He had put it down half-finished. The remainder sat on the floor beside him, untouched, and there, at the captain's station, the curved console that commanded the best view of every other console, the captain. The combine officer had not moved from the position he had taken when the bridge changed hands. He sat in his own command chair with the stillness of a man who had run out of procedures to follow and was waiting for a new set to be issued. He had eaten his slab. He had not spoken since dictating whatever entry he had put into the ship's log. His face held no expression that Quintus could read, but his hands were still, and a man whose hands are still when his world has inverted is either broken or thinking. Quintus was not yet certain which. He sat up. The chair protested, some pneumatic mechanism shifting under his weight with a hiss. The bridge noticed. Pakla's eyes flicked to him and away. Sevhel's posture shifted from guarding to reporting. Tigo's gaze refocused from the middle distance to the present. Only Deka slept on. Good. Quintus stood. His back informed him, with the thorough inventory of a body that had slept upright in armor more times than it had slept in a bed, exactly how much the chair had cost him. He catalogued the complaints: lower spine, left hip, the old injury in his right knee that had never properly healed after Ctesiphon, and dismissed them. He walked to the main display. The star chart was still running, Pakla's heading marked in a line of green light that cut through a field of amber and red markers he could not read but whose density he understood instinctively. Sparse where they were going, dense where they had come from. Whatever the avoided cluster was, whatever waited in the territory the Combine had marked as forbidden, it lay ahead in the direction of fewer markers, less traffic, less oversight. He had built a career on operating in places where the oversight was thin. Pakla did not look up from the display as he approached. Her hands remained still. The light from the chart moved across her face in slow waves. The ship's movement through whatever medium it traversed rendered as a gentle scroll of data she could not read but was learning to feel. Bachelji said. She looked at him, assessing. She had been doing this since the holding bay, watching him the way a hawk watches a dog, as a creature whose behavior reveals the terrain's intention. He did not speak her language. She did not speak his. But they had been operating in the same space for 8 days, and certain things had become clear through repetition and gesture, and the brutal economy of people who cannot waste words they do not share. He pointed to her, then to the navigation display. In the knife, then I opened both hands and stepped back. You navigate, this is yours. She watched him for a moment, then she turned back to the display. That was acceptance. The command structure was not a decision, it was a recognition. Quintus did not call meetings. Meetings were for deliberative bodies with the luxury of time and the structural expectation of dissent. He had neither. What he had was a ship he did not understand, 600 people in various states of injury and confusion and linguistic isolation, a heading into unknown space, and the finite window before whoever had sent the recovery team realized the recovery team had been redirected and sent something else. So he did not convene, he walked. He found Hattori first. The man from the Warring Islands, Quintus, had not learned the name of the place, only recognized the culture's shape and the way Hattori carried himself, was in the secondary corridor between the bridge and the main holding sections. It was seated on the floor with his back against the wall, and he was watching a junction point where 3 corridors met. He had chosen the position with the care of a man who understood that information moves through choke points. Quintus stopped. Hattori looked up. Their eyes met. Quintus recognized the type, not the officers who led from the front, not the ones who commanded through volume, the ones who sat in the back of the command tent and asked the question that made everyone else in the room realize they had been discussing the wrong problem. The strategist, the ones whose value lay in what they saw. Quintus pointed to Hattori. Then he pointed outward, toward the hull, toward the space beyond. Then he tapped his own temple. You watch what's out there. You tell me what it means. Hattori's eyes narrowed slightly. He tilted his head. Consideration. He was, Quintus suspected, evaluating whether this assignment was a genuine distribution of authority or a polite form of exclusion. Quintus held his gaze. He had commanded men from 17 provinces of an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. He knew the difference between a man who wanted power and a man who wanted purpose, and the night wanted purpose. After a long moment, Hattori inclined his head. A fraction, precisely calibrated, accepted, with conditions we will negotiate when we share enough words to negotiate them. Gwendis could live with that. He moved on. Aishe was in the forward holding bay. He heard her before he saw her, her voice carrying through the open hatchway in a register he had come to recognize as her working tone. Measured, the cadence of someone who was building a bridge out of sound and patience, one word at a time. She was sitting on the floor across from two of the scaled beings, the ones with the jointed legs and the eyes like broken glass that caught light in segments. Between them, scratched into the metal floor with something sharp, was a grid of symbols. Combined words. She was pointing to each one and speaking it, and the beings were responding with sounds that were close but different, and the gap was narrowing. She looked up when Quintus appeared in the hatchway. Her expression was the one she wore when interrupted during important work, a precise communication that his presence had better be worth the break in rhythm. He pointed to her, then to the holding bay, then to the beings, then he touched his throat and his ear. You speak for us, you listen for us, this is yours. Aishe studied him for a moment. Then one corner of her mouth moved, an acknowledgement between two people who understood that the person who speaks for the group carries a weight that the person who fights for the group will never have to. She nodded once and turned back to her work. The grid on the floor had grown by 3 symbols since he had last looked. The captain's station smelled like the captain, a dry, slightly mineral scent that Quintus had catalogued as the natural odor of whatever species the combine officer belonged to. It was layered under the industrial clean smell of the bridge's air system and something else, like old paper or very dry wood, the smell of a being who had occupied the same chair for longer than Quintus had been alive. Quintus approached the station. The captain watched him come, those wide-set eyes amber, with horizontal pupils that contracted in the bridge's constant light, tracked him with curiosity. He had stopped being afraid. The captain spoke. The words were combine language, fluid and consonant-heavy, and Quintus understood none of them. But he had spent 23 years reading men, reading their posture, their breath, the way their weight shifted when they were about to commit, and the captain's body was saying something very clear. I am still here. I have not been told what I am. Tell me what I am. Quintus stopped at arm's length, close enough to be heard, far enough to be safe. The captain's hands were on the armrests of his chair, visible, still, unthreatening. The captain spoke again, longer this time. The tone was steady, almost rhythmic, the cadence of a man delivering a report. Quintus caught the shape of it even without the words. Something about years, something about systems, something about knowledge. I have run the ship for 41 years. I know every system and every failure mode. If you want to keep it running, I am more useful explaining it than sitting here. A practical assessment of remaining leverage, delivered with the bureaucratic precision of a man who had spent 4 decades managing freight manifests and was now managing the only asset he had left, himself. Quintus regarded him. The captain was taller than any of them. His frame was narrow, built for a lighter gravity or a different evolutionary pressure, and his skin had the faintly luminous quality of something that had not evolved under a yellow sun. He was not human, he was not a threat. He had made a calculation, and the calculation had told him that cooperation was the optimal remaining strategy. Quintus understood this man. He had commanded auxiliaries from a dozen conquered peoples, and the ones who survived and thrived were the ones who made exactly this calculation at exactly this moment. Good, he said. Latin. The captain did not understand the word. He understood the tone. The captain's hands lifted from the armrests. He turned in his chair and touched the console, tentatively, watching Quintus's face for the response. When no response came except continued attention, his movements grew more assured. Symbols appeared on the display. He pointed to them, then to the overhead light strip, then made an adjustment. The light shifted, warmer, steadier. He pointed to the display again, then to the air vents, then to a readout that Quintus could not read but whose shape looked like a countdown. Life support. This is how it works. This is how long it lasts. The captain was teaching. Quintus pulled a chair from the adjacent station and sat down beside him. Finding the slaver required going deeper into the ship than Quintus had yet been. The maintenance section was 3 levels below the bridge, accessed through a series of progressively narrower corridors that reminded Quintus uncomfortably of the approach to a mine. The lighting changed from the steady sodium orange of the operational decks to a dimmer, more intermittent blue-white that pulsed with the ship's deeper rhythms. The air was different here too, warmer, denser. The smell of working machinery, of lubricant and ozone and hot metal from systems being used hard. He found the slaver in the 3rd compartment. The combine officer was not hiding. This was the first thing Quintus noticed, and it told him everything he needed to know about what kind of man the slaver was. He was maintaining a piece of equipment. The device was mounted to the bulkhead, a dense block of what looked like dark ceramic, threaded with conduits that pulsed faintly with the same blue-white light as the corridor. Some kind of processing unit, Quintus guessed, environmental probably. The slaver had removed a panel from its casing and was working inside it with tools that were built for his hands, long-fingered, precise, the movements of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He had heard Quintus coming. Of course he had. The slaver was the one member of the combine crew who actually understood what he was carrying, and a man who understands dangerous cargo does not let anything approach unannounced. He did not stop working. Quintus stopped at the compartment's entrance and waited. The slaver's hands continued their work for exactly long enough to establish that the interruption was being acknowledged on his terms, not Quintus's. Then he turned. Their eyes met. The slaver was different from the captain. Where the captain had the softened edges of a career administrator, a man worn smooth by decades of routine, the slaver had the angles of a practitioner. His body was leaner, his movements more economical, his eyes, darker than the captain's, with pupils that adjusted faster, belonged to a man who had spent his life assessing the threat level of living things. He was looking at Quintus the way Quintus had seen horse traders look at horses. With professional interest, the slaver spoke, combined language, but delivered in a register distinctly different from the captain's, shorter phrases, harder consonants, the cadence of a man who stated, never explained. Quintus did not understand the words. He understood the shape. I redirected the patrol. You know this. I did not do it for you. Quintus nodded. I know. The slaver watched him for a long moment. Then he set down his tool, straightened to his full height. He was shorter than the captain, but broader, heavier, built for something other than sitting in a chair, and crossed his arms. 2 professionals, separated by species, by language, by every possible structural difference, recognizing in each other the pragmatist calculus. I am useful. You need what I know. We do not trust each other. We do not need to. The slaver uncrossed his arms. He picked up the tool. He turned back to his work. He had left the access panel open. The machinery inside was visible, complex, but laid out with the same design for operation simplicity that Decca had identified in every system on this ship. Watch, the slaver's posture said. Learn. This is how I am useful. Quintus watched. He learned. He would send Decca down here within the hour. She would understand what she was looking at, and the slaver would teach her, because teaching her increased his value, and his value was the only thing keeping him alive, and he knew it, and Quintus knew he knew it, and neither of them acknowledged this because acknowledging it would be a waste of time that could be spent on machinery. He found the viewport on his way back. It was in a junction between the maintenance level and the upper decks, a section of hull that had been replaced with something transparent, or that had always been transparent, and he had simply never paused long enough to look. The material was not glass. It was something denser, faintly warm to the touch. When he rested his hand against it, and through it, he could see stars. More stars than he had ever seen from any hilltop in any province of the empire, because there was no atmosphere to dim them and no horizon to cut them short. They filled the viewport from edge to edge, cold and white and absolutely silent, and they were moving, or rather the ship was moving past them, and the effect was a slow, majestic drift that made the stomach feel unmoored and the mind feel very small. He stood there. The Legion had numbered 480 men at full complement. That number had been in his head since he was 19, since the day he had first been told it, standing in a parade ground in Carnuntum with dust on his sandals and the Danube gray behind the fort walls. And his centurion had said the number as if it were the most important number in the world, and for 23 years it had been. 480 men, arranged in 10 lines of 48, or 8 lines of 60, or 6 centuries of 80, depending on the tactical requirement. He could list the names of every centurion he had served under, and most of the options, and a startling number of the legionaries who had rotated through his own century in the years he had held it. He could tell you who snored and who didn't, who cheated at dice and who was too honest for his own good, who would hold a position until death, and who would break at the first taste of blood and needed to be positioned accordingly. That number, that structure, that was Rome, distilled to its functional element, the men standing in formation who made the Senate, the temples, and the roads possible. He was not going back to count them. He knew this. He had known it since the cell. He had known it when he walked into the holding bay and started organizing strangers into groups. He had known it when he stood on the bridge and rejected the captain's classification categories, because accepting them would mean accepting that something other than Rome decided who he was, and that was not a concession he would make even to an empire that spanned more territory than Rome had ever dreamed of. But knowing it and feeling it were different operations, and the gap between them was exactly the width of this viewport, and the depth of the black beyond it, and the cold light of stars that no Roman had ever named, because no Roman had ever stood where he was standing. He touched the ring on his left hand, unit ring, iron, the legion symbol stamped into its face, the boar, the laurel, the number. He had worn it for so long that the skin beneath it was a different color, and the metal had thinned on the underside where it rubbed against the next finger, and it was the only object from his life that had come with him into the ship. He pressed his palm flat against the viewport. The material was warm. The stars moved behind his fingers. Rome was behind the ship in the direction they were not going, on a world classified Tier 7 in a database that no one had reviewed, in a province of an empire that thought it ruled the known world and did not know, could not know, how small the known world was. He let the grief arrive. He held it for exactly the length of one breath. Then he put it in the place where he kept all the things that were true and could not be changed, and he took his hand off the viewport, and he turned, and he walked back toward the bridge. The Lewis was 600 people on this ship. They needed a command structure that would hold past the first crisis. He had built one in less time with worse materials. The bridge had not changed. Sevhel at the door, Pakla at the nav display, Tigo on the floor still and watching. The captain at his station, now with a display active, that had not been active before. He had taken Quintus's attention as permission and was methodically walking through something Quintus suspected was a systems tutorial for an audience of one absent student. Deca was still asleep. Quintus crossed to his chair and sat. The pneumatic mechanism hissed again. He ignored it. He checked the nav display from his position, the heading held, the green line unchanged, the amber markers no closer than they had been. He waited for the ship to tell him what it needed next, for the pattern to emerge. He had been a soldier long enough to know that the interval between crises was reconnaissance, conducted from a stationary position, using the only instrument that could not be taken from you, attention. 12 minutes later, Deca woke up. She woke the way he had seen field soldiers wake, all at once, no transition, from sleep to full awareness in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Her head came up off her arm. Her eyes opened. Her hands were on the console before her vision had finished focusing. She was reading, scrolling. Whatever she saw on the display, she was processing it with the systematic speed of someone who had been trained to triage information, take the critical items first, file the rest. Then she stopped. Her hands went still on the console. Her shoulders tightened. Quintus recognized it. Focus. The focus of someone who has found the thing they were not looking for. She scrolled back, read again, scrolled forward, read a third time. Quintus, he was already standing. She said his name in the way of someone who has learned it recently and is still testing its weight. Roman, 2 syllables, the emphasis on the first, the vowels slightly flattened by an accent from 2,000 years after his death. But she said it clearly, and she said it with urgency, and that was all the language they needed. He was at her console in 4 strides. The display showed a navlog, entries in Combine script that he could not read, but whose structure he could parse by position, timestamps on the left, coordinates in the center, status markers on the right. Decca was pointing to an entry near the bottom of the log, one that was highlighted in a color he had not seen in the display before. Red, not the amber of normal traffic. Red. The recovery team, she said. She spoke slowly, choosing words he might recognize from their shared working vocabulary of gesture and repetition. Their new heading. I thought last night it was a destination, a place they were sent to. She pulled up a second display, a map, the green line of their heading, and another line, red, that did not end at a point. It intersected theirs. It's not a destination, Decca said. It's an intercept. Whoever redirected the team, they thought it would take us longer to take the ship. They calculated our speed based on the old heading. We're faster now, on Pakla's course. She paused, and fingers moved on the console, running the calculation again. But they'll adjust. They're already adjusting. The intercept line shifted 6 hours ago. Updated coordinates, tighter angle. She looked up at him. We have less time than I thought. Quintus looked at the red line cutting across the green. How much less? Decca checked the calculation a second time. Her fingers moved through the sequence with the precision of someone who understood that this particular answer needed to be right, because the distance between right and almost right was the distance between arriving somewhere and being caught in transit. He checked it a third time. I'm still checking, she said. The bridge hummed. The stars moved. The green line held its course, and the red line held its own, and somewhere, in the narrowing space between them, the Combine's bureaucracy was filing a revised estimate of arrival. Aishe sat down in his chair. He had work to do. The synthesis matrix was a coffin standing on its end. That was Dika's first thought when she descended into the engineering sublevel 18 hours ago, and it was still her thought now. The machine occupied the center of the compartment like a monument to itself, 2.5 meters tall, matte gray, every visible surface covered in Combine notation that she couldn't read but was learning to feel. The dispensing tray jutted from its midsection at waist height, a slot roughly the size and charm of a mail drop. Above it, a configurator interface spread across a panel, the width of her shoulders, rows of symbols, sliders, input fields, all in that blocky Combine script that looked like someone had tried to invent an alphabet using only right angles. She'd been standing in front of it so long, her lower back had developed its own heartbeat. The captain's explanation, delivered through Aishe's halting translation 2 watches ago, had been simple. The matrix converts base feedstock into nutritional output. The feedstock is stored in a sealed reservoir beneath the deck. The output parameters determine what comes out. Currently, the output parameters are set to slab, which the captain described using a Combine word that Aishe rendered as sufficient sustenance unit. Sufficient. Dika turned that word over. 600 people eating sufficient sustenance units 3 times a day for 8 days. She'd seen what sufficient looked like in the feeding bay. Gray-brown rectangles with the texture of compressed sawdust, a faint chemical sweetness that wasn't sweet enough to be food and wasn't absent enough to be nothing. People ate them the way she'd seen people eat emergency rations in Dadaab, mechanically, eyes elsewhere. the act of chewing reduced to a body function rather than an experience. The difference between surviving and living was, frequently, a meal. She leaned closer to the configurator panel. 18 hours had given her enough to map the interface's architecture, if not its language. The slab setting used 3 parameters. 3. Out of, she counted again, running her finger along the rows, 47 available input fields. 27. Somebody had built a machine with 47 degrees of freedom and then locked 44 of them. The fields were grayed out in the interface, but physically present in the panel's layout, and when she'd pried the panel side cover off 6 hours ago, the connectors behind each locked field were identical to the connectors behind the 3 active ones. The Combine built this machine to do exactly what they needed it to do and no more, she thought, pressing her thumb against one of the grayed out sliders. It didn't move. That's usually a trap. Right now it's a gift. If they'd built it properly, I'd have no idea how to get inside it. Because the lock wasn't cryptographic, wasn't mechanical, it was administrative. Someone with configurator access had set the 44 fields to default values and then flagged them as non-adjustable. The flag was a single symbol in the field header, the same symbol on every locked field. Deka didn't know what the symbol meant. She didn't need to. She'd already found it in the panel's physical wiring, a bypass loop that routed each flagged field's input away from the processing core and into a dead register. Snip the loop, the field becomes live. If she'd snipped the first 340 minutes ago using a sharpened edge from a broken deck plate, her fingers still smelled like ozone where the insulation had scorched. The 3 fields she'd unlocked were, she was fairly sure, related to output density, chemical composition ratio, and something she couldn't identify but suspected was texture. She derived this from first principles. The 3 active slab parameters controlled volume, dispensing rate, and what she thought of as repeat cycle. The unlocked fields sat adjacent in the physical layout, which in every engineering architecture she'd ever encountered meant they governed related functions. Fairly sure, suspected, thought of as, she was about to feed 600 people based on educated guesses and the spatial logic of an alien machine she'd known for 18 hours. Deka pulled her stylus, a repurposed probe from the captain's bridge kit with a tip narrow enough to interact with the Combine touch input, and tapped the first unlocked field. Something on the display changed. She couldn't read it, but the machine hummed differently. "All right," she said aloud, because the engineering sublevel was empty, and sometimes the sound of her own voice was the only thing that confirmed she was awake. "Let's see what you can do." She set the unlocked density field high, the composition field to what she hoped was a midpoint, and the texture field to, honestly, random, because she had no baseline. Then she initiated a dispensing cycle. The matrix hummed. The hum rose in pitch, which was new. The dispensing slot produced a sound like a very dignified belch. What emerged onto the tray was a rectangle approximately the size and shape of a standard nutrient slab, but the color of sidewalk chalk and the consistency of wet putty. It was chalk white, faintly luminous, and it smelled like electrical fire and old pennies. Deka picked it up. It was warm. It had weight. It was, technically, a thing that the machine had produced in response to her inputs. She bit the corner. Her tongue delivered its report. Mineral, acrid, with a lingering aftertaste of ionized copper that sat in the back of her throat like a warning. Idol. And probably, her stomach didn't reject it outright, which by the standards of her first week on the ship qualified as a passing grade. "Worth eating?" She set it back on the tray. Her face was specific. Recalibration, not disgust. She'd eaten worse in worse places. The density was too high, the composition was wrong in a direction she could feel but couldn't name, and the texture setting had apparently meant chalk. She'd need to adjust all 3 and figure out which direction each parameter moved the output. She was going to need more attempts. He was going to need Aishe. The Romani woman arrived 2 hours later with vocabulary lists inked on her forearm in the Combine's angular script. Because paper didn't exist on the ship, and skin was the most portable writing surface she had. "You've been busy," Aishe said, looking at the engineering sub-level. Dika had rearranged the space since her last visit. The panel cover was off, the bypass wiring visible, and 3 failed output slabs were lined up on the dispensing tray like evidence at an inquest. I unlocked 44 additional parameters. The Nozak Ahatish raised both eyebrows. 44? The slab setting uses 3. The machine has 47. Somebody locked the rest. Deliberately. Administratively. Datika gestured at the grayed out fields on the panel. Same lockout flag on every one. I've opened 3 so far. The first attempt, she pointed at the chalk white rectangle. Don't eat that one. Aishe picked it up, sniffed it, and set it down with the careful precision of someone who has handled worse but sees no reason to prove it. I have the interface words, she said, turning her forearm so Decca could see the inked list. 41 combine words I've confirmed from the PA system, the captain's explanations, and the freed species. 11 of those appear on this panel. Show me. Aishe stepped to the configurator. Her finger moved across the field headers, pausing at each one she recognized. This one is quantity, the same root as the cargo manifest number. This one is cycle, I think, as in repetition. This, she frowned, turning her arm to compare. This is texture, but the combine word carries a secondary meaning. Resistance, how much the thing pushes back against the mouth, against processing. Mouthfeel, Dika said. I don't know that word. How a food feels when you chew it. Never mind, it's perfect. That's the texture parameter. What about this one? She pointed at the composition field she'd unlocked. She studied it, checked her arm, studied it again. This is 2 words compressed into 1 symbol. The first is balance, ratio, proportion. The second is, it could be life, or energy, or metabolic function. The captain used it when he described the feedstock conversion, nutritional balance. Deka was already adjusting her mental model. So the 3 I unlocked are density, nutritional balance, and mouthfeel. That's a start. She picked up her stylus. Help me with the others? They worked side by side for the next hour. Aishe's vocabulary list was a key that fit some locks and not others. Of the 47 total parameters, she could identify 19 by cross-referencing combine roots she knew with the field labels. Some were obvious once named: temperature, moisture content, dispensing shape. Others were opaque. One field Aishe translated as memory, which could mean anything from shelf life to data logging to something neither of them had a framework for. But 19 identified parameters out of 47 was enough to try again. Attempt 2, Deka said, adjusting density down, nutritional balance toward what she hoped was a human-compatible midpoint, and mouthfeel away from chalk and toward, she guessed, less chalk. The matrix hummed, the slot dispensed. What came out was brown this time, roughly the right color for something that could claim kinship with food, and when Deka pressed it between her fingers, the texture yielded. Progress. She broke it in half, handed 1 piece to Aishe. They bit simultaneously. Better, measurably better. The texture landed between bread and compressed grain. Wrong, but in the neighborhood of right. The problem was the taste, which swung wildly between sour and sweet in a way that suggested the nutritional balance parameter didn't work the way she'd assumed. Her tongue kept trying to categorize what it was receiving and failing, because the chemical signature of the output was fighting with itself. Wrong balance, Deka said, chewing thoughtfully. But the texture is close. Aishana swallowed her piece without complaint, which Deka had learned was the Romani woman's version of a positive review. Closer than the chalk, the balance parameter isn't a simple slider. It's controlling multiple nutritional components at once: proteins, sugars, fats, whatever the combined equivalent categories are, and moving it in one direction skews everything. I need to find the subparameters. There may not be subparameters. The combine may not separate them. Deka looked at the 47 fields, looked at the 19 Aishe had identified, looked at the 28 unknowns. Then I'll separate them myself, she said. The third attempt took them another hour and a half of iterative adjustments. Aishe identified two more parameter fields. One she translated as acid or sharpness, the other as weight in a nutritional rather than physical sense. Dika tweaked the balance field back toward neutral and used the new acid and weight parameters to compensate. The matrix hummed, dispensed, and produced something that was, by every measurable criterion, food. It was brown, it had the texture of dense bread, it held together when you picked it up. It smelled like nothing objectionable. The nutritional indicator on the dispensing tray, a light that Deka had finally figured out, was a quality readout, glowed the steady amber that meant within acceptable parameters. When Deka bit into it, she chewed, she set it down. It tastes like nothing, she said. Technically correct nothing, Feu. Aishe took her piece, ate it, considered. That is still progress. In my experience, technically correct nothing is 3 steps from something. 3 steps. I have been making something out of technically correct nothing my whole life, Dika. The warmth in Aishe's voice was earned. She was sharing a credential, not offering comfort. The trick is always the same. You learn what the machine can do. Then you learn what it won't do. Then you do the thing in between. Deka almost smiled. Almost. I'll take another pass, but first I want to look at the dispensing logs. The synthesis matrix kept logs. Dika had noticed the logging function 6 hours into her first session, a data field at the bottom of the configurator panel that she'd initially dismissed as a status readout. It was an archive. Every dispensing cycle the matrix had ever run was recorded, timestamp, parameter settings, output quantity, feedstock consumption, and this was the part that stopped her, a field Aishe had translated as purpose designator. The cargo slabs, the gray-brown rectangles they'd been eating for 8 days, were logged under a purpose designator that Aishe rendered as sustenance, tokens made as sustenance, digsates, detend anixa seal. Deka had scrolled back through the log entries. Every single slab dispensed since they'd been brought aboard carried the same designator. She had scrolled further, older entries from before their harvest, presumably for previous cargo, carried the same designator with minor parameter variations. She scrolled further still. The log went back years, decades. The matrix had been running the same basic output parameters, with minor adjustments for species-specific tolerances, for longer than she'd been alive. And every entry, without exception, carried a calibration code. Dika didn't know what the calibration code meant. It was a string of combine symbols appended to each log entry, consistent, standardized, clearly referencing something outside the synthesis system itself. She'd initially assumed it was a quality control reference, a batch number, a maintenance tag. It wasn't. Aishe had identified the first symbol in the string, behavior, and the second, compliance, and the third, which took her 20 minutes of cross-referencing and left her very quiet when she was done, optimal. The calibration code linked each slab's nutritional output to a behavioral compliance metric. Deka opened the code's referenced file. It was a table, 2 columns. The left column listed metabolic output values, caloric content, protein ratio, micronutrient density, in precise combine units that she couldn't convert but could compare. The right column listed behavioral indicators, also in combine shorthand, but the structure was unmistakable: frequency of movement, vocalization rates, sleep cycles, resistance events. The table showed a clear correlation. As metabolic output decreased, resistance events decreased. The slab parameters weren't set to the metabolic minimum. Dika could see the minimum. The table listed it as a floor value, a baseline below which the combine's own documentation flagged output as insufficient for cargo viability. The slab parameters were set above that floor, 80% above, specifically, consistently, precisely 80% of metabolic minimum. The cargo didn't starve, didn't sicken visibly, didn't become unviable for sale. and stayed just far enough below full metabolic function that everything, moving, thinking, fighting, planning, hoping, was a little harder than it needed to be. Dika sat with us for a long time. The engineering sub-level was very quiet. The matrix hummed its standby hum. The 3 failed slabs sat on the dispensing tray, evidence of her 18 hours of work. Above her, somewhere in the ship's middle decks, 600 people were eating 80% slabs and wondering why their bodies felt heavy and their thoughts came slow, and the corridor walks they took between feedings left them winded. He thought about the burned man whose arms had been mapped with electrical scars from the ship's containment systems. He thought about the incapacitated captives they'd found in the holding bay, barely conscious, too weak to stand. He thought about the children. There were children aboard. She'd seen them in the feeding rotation, eating rectangles of calibrated insufficiency 3 times a day, while their growing bodies ran 20% short of what they needed. This was calibration. This was a parameter setting. Someone, some combine technician, maybe centuries ago, had found the correlation between metabolic suppression and resistance reduction, and had set the synthesis matrix accordingly, and had failed the documentation, and the documentation had been replicated across every harvest ship in the fleet, and no one had reviewed it since because it worked. It worked. The Dika stood up. She found Aishe in the corridor outside the sub-level, where the Romani woman had been sitting on a junction cover, reviewing her vocabulary lists. They were running it at 80%, Dika said. The slabs, to keep us slow. Cost doesn't matter to a machine. Her voice was flat. The flatness was anger. Aishe looked up, her dark eyes moved across Dika's face, reading the terrain of it the way she read every room she entered, for threat, for need, for what was unspoken. Show me, Aishe said. Dika showed her the log, the calibration code, the behavioral compliance table, the 80% line. Aishe read it all without speaking, her inked forearm pressed against the edge of the panel, her lips moving slightly as she translated the combined symbols she knew and inferred the ones she didn't. When she was done, she straightened. Her expression was complex in a way Dika was still learning to read, older and more settled than shock or outrage. I have known about deliberate suppression my whole life, Aishe said quietly. I did not need to learn it from a log file. She paused. But you did, and watching you learn it is its own kind of useful. Dika understood. She understood it the way she understood structural engineering. The information itself was not the payload. The payload was what you did with it. Aishe had survived suppression, survived being made deliberately less, deliberately slower, deliberately smaller, since before the Combine existed. She carried that knowledge in her bones, in her family's memory, in the way she read every room she entered for the exit. For Dika, daughter of a world that had named these things, cataloged them, built international frameworks to condemn them, the log file was new, and the fact it described was not. I'm going to fix it, Dika said. I know, right now, before the next feeding rotation. I know that too. Dika turned back to the synthesis matrix. The 4th attempt was not elegant. She'd been awake for 20 hours. Her hands had a fine tremor that she was managing by pressing her wrists against the panel edge. The anger from the suppression log had settled into stubbornness, denser, colder, with better structural integrity. The stubbornness of a woman who had learned at 18 to repair field generators in places where the supply chain was a fiction and the spare parts were whatever you could fabricate from what the last team left behind. He set the metabolic output to 100%, full caloric density, full protein, full micronutrient spectrum. The Combine's own documentation told her what the values should be, the floor was listed, the optimal was implied by the behavioral table, and the difference was a gap she could calculate even in Combine units. Then she went back to the texture and taste parameters. Aishe sat beside her, no longer translating but present. Occasionally she'd point at a field label and say a word, sometimes the Combine word, sometimes a word in her own language that Dika didn't understand, but which carried enough inflection to communicate yes, that one, or careful. That's different than you think. Deka adjusted the acid parameter down, the weight parameter up, the mouthfeel parameter to a setting she'd derived from the 3 failed attempts, a point she'd mapped on her mental model as dense enough to feel real, soft enough to not fight you. She adjusted 3 more parameters she'd unlocked in the last hour. One Aishe had identified as aroma, one as color, and one whose label neither of them could translate, but whose position in the physical layout sat between taste and texture, and which Deka decided to call warmth until someone told her otherwise. She set warmth to high. Dispensing, she said. The matrix hummed. The hum was different again, fuller, more sustained, with a harmonic undertone she hadn't heard before. The machine was working harder, using more of itself. The feedstock reservoir under the deck vibrated faintly through the floor. The dispensing slot produced a 4th attempt. It was small, deliberately. She'd kept the volume conservative. It was brown, a warm brown, darker than the slabs. It held its shape on the tray. When Deka picked it up, it was warm in her hand, genuinely warm, and the warmth carried an aroma that was close to food. Grain adjacent, something in the neighborhood of toasted grain, or heated starch, or the smell of a kitchen where someone was cooking something simple that required patience. She broke it in half. The interior was slightly lighter than the exterior. It yielded like bread that hadn't quite risen. It wasn't bread, it wasn't anything she could name, but it was warm, and it smelled like something a person had made, and when she bit into it, the taste was there. Not good, not familiar, not correct in any way she could map to a cuisine or a memory or a tradition, but present. The 3rd attempt had tasted like nothing, technically correct nothing, she'd said, and meant it. The 4th attempt tasted like something, a simple, plain, warm something, with grain-adjacent density and a faint nuttiness that might have been the protein component expressing itself, and a finish that lingered just long enough to register on her tongue before fading. It was imperfect, clearly wrong in ways she could enumerate, 9 things from taste alone, and she suspected the nutritional profile was still uneven in ways she'd need more iterations to fix. But it was warm, and it was real, and it was 100% of metabolic minimum, which meant that every person who ate it would be, for the first time since they'd been brought aboard this ship, fully fed. She handed the other half to Aishe. Aishe ate it slowly, her eyes closed for a moment. She didn't speak. "It's not right," Deka said. "No, it's not done. No, but it's you make it it's enough to start with." Deka reached for the dispensing controls and initiated a full batch cycle, setting the output to 600 portions at the volume that matched the standard feeding rotation. Kivizam sustained, committed, and began to produce. The first batch went to the feeding bay 40 minutes later. Deka didn't go herself. She sent the portions through the distribution conveyor and stayed at the matrix, watching the feedstock reservoir levels and the output quality indicator, because she was an engineer and the machine was running a new configuration for the first time, and someone needed to watch it in case it seized or surged or decided that 47 parameters were too many to manage and defaulted back to slabs. Aishe went. Aishe was always the bridge. 20 minutes later, Aishe returned. She stood in the sub-level doorway, and her face carried something Deka had learned to read as the news is small but the news is good. One of the group, I don't know which era, she doesn't share any of my words. She ate it. All of it. And then she said one word. What word? I don't know her language, but I've heard that word before, in a different context. The freed species use a cognate when they describe something that meets a need without exceeding it. What does it mean? Aishe paused. Considered. Enough. Deka exhaled. She was still standing at the synthesis matrix, her hands on the panel edge, the feedstock reservoir humming under the deck. She was exhausted and angry, and the anger had been useful, and the exhaustion was starting to win. Her eyes burned. The river back had given up having its own heartbeat and settled for a steady ache. Someone had eaten the thing she'd made and said enough. That was the bar. They'd hit it. She allowed herself 4 minutes. 4 minutes of standing still with her eyes closed, feeling the matrix hum through her palms, before she sealed the panel, collected her stylus, and climbed the ladder to the corridor level. The bridge was 2 decks up. She could have slept. 20 hours was 20 hours, and her body knew it, but the suppression log was still in her head, and the number 0.80 was still behind her eyes, and sleep was not going to happen until she told someone else about it. Someone who would understand the engineering implications. The bridge was quiet. Third watch, the broad-shouldered woman with the close-cropped hair, Pakla. Deka reminded herself. She'd learned the name 4 days ago, and it had stuck because of the way the woman wore it, spare and directional, was at the navigation station, doing what she always did, reading the star chart like it was land. Deka crossed to the engineering console, pulled up the navigation overlay, looked at the recovery team's intercept heading that Pakla had been tracking since they changed course toward the avoided cluster. The heading had changed. They adjusted again, Pakla said, without looking up. When? This watch. 6 hours ago, then again 2 hours ago. Tighter each time. Pakla's finger traced the 2 most recent trajectory lines on the display. They converged on the Arvith's projected position like lines of sight narrowing on a target. They're faster than we are. They get lit the navigation display. The trajectories were clear. The recovery team was closing the gap, barely visible in any single hour, undeniable over days, the way a current erodes a bank. Then she looked at the engineering display, the power distribution schematic, the drive output versus the mass the drives were pushing, the load balance, how the ship's internal weight was distributed across its structural frame. Then she looked back at the navigation display. The ship is holding back, she said. Pakla turned, not deliberately, but whoever designed the cargo hold configuration distributed the mass wrong. All the weight is aft, the cells, the feedstock reservoir, the containment systems. The drives compensate, but compensation costs power. We're spending 20% of our drive output just fighting our own mass distribution. She could see it now, clear as a wiring diagram. The Combine had designed the ship to carry cargo that didn't want to be carried, and they'd put the cargo as far from the bridge as possible, and they'd put the containment systems next to the cargo, and they'd put the feedstock next to the containment systems, and the cumulative result was a ship that flew like it was dragging an anchor because its architects had optimized for control rather than speed. We could be 20% faster, Deka said, with a different load balance. Pakla looked at the recovery team's trajectory, looked at Deka. The Comanche woman's expression was the one Deka had learned to read as "tell me more." I need to redistribute the mass, move the feedstock forward, shift the containment weight, rebalance the structural load across the frame. It's not a small job, but the ship was built for slave labor to operate, which means the cargo systems are modular, which means they can be moved. She was already running the calculations in her head, matching what she knew of the drive system against what she'd learned of the structural frame during her 18 hours in the sub-level. Give me 2 days and 30 people who can lift. Pakla looked at the star chart, looked at the closing trajectories, looked at the 2 days of margin they might or might not have. She nodded once. Deka marked the synthesis problem as solved for now, failed the suppression log in the part of her mind where she kept things that would fuel her for a very long time, and began sketching a mass redistribution plan on the engineering console. The R-Zone 1 slower than it needed to be, not for much longer. The hold smelled different from the rest of the ship. Aishe had catalogued the Arvezer by sections over 3 days, the way she had once catalogued the dialects of market towns along the Danube. Her lungs noticed before her mind did. The bridge smelled of recycled metal and the faint chemical sweetness. The ventilation system pushed through every corridor, an odor hovering between anise and copper. The corridor outside engineering smelled of heat, the dry scorch of systems working harder than they were designed to. The cell blocks they had all woken up in still carried the residual bite of ozone and industrial solvent, a smell she associated with the first 6 hours of terror and would associate with it for the rest of her life. The hold where the three waited smelled like rain on warm stone. She didn't know what produced it, some combination of their skin chemistry and the slightly different humidity they required, which Dika had adjusted 2 days ago by isolating the hold's environmental controls and setting them to a profile the three had selected themselves. The adjustment had taken 11 minutes and involved Dika lying on her back under a console while Aishe relayed instructions through 5 combined words and a lot of pointing. The result was a space that felt, to Aishe, like the moment before a summer storm in the foothills of Transylvania, when the air thickened and the dust settled and everything alive went quiet because something was coming. She'd stood at the threshold now, carrying a tray. The tray held 4 portions of the synthesis matrix output, the compressed nutrient slabs that were technically food in the same way that a map was technically a country. 3 portions for them, 1 for her. She had learned on the second day that sharing the meal mattered. Eating together was a language act. It said, "I am here to stay for a while. I am not afraid of being close to you. I consider us the same kind of thing, at least for this purpose." Aishe did not made in a dozen languages in life before the cell. Some she had learned young, absorbing them the way children absorb weather. Romani from her mother, Hungarian from the market, German from the traders who wintered in the valley. Others she had learned by necessity, building them word by word, in rooms where not understanding could mean not surviving. She had learned the shapes of church Latin from a priest who sheltered her family for 3 nights and expected nothing in return except someone to talk to. She had learned enough Ottoman Turkish to lie convincingly at a checkpoint. She had learned the register of Bavarian German that meant a shopkeeper's wife was about to offer food instead of calling for the constable. Every language was a compromise. Every word in every language was a round thing trying to fit a square idea. The gap between the word and the meaning it circled, that was where the interesting part lived. That was where you found out what mattered to the people who spoke it, because the words they had invented told you what they had needed to name, and the words they hadn't told you what they had never encountered or could not bear to look at directly. She loved that gap. She had always loved it. She crossed the threshold into the hold. The 3 were arranged in a loose triangle on the far side of the space, which was roughly 12 meters square, and had been, based on the anchor points in the floor, a secondary cargo pen. The Combine had stored them here. The anchor points had held restraints. Dika had removed the restraints on day 1, cutting through the composite bolts with a tool she'd found in the maintenance corridor and pronouncing them the most offensively overbuilt things I have ever seen, and I once watched a UN contractor install earthquake-rated hinges on a latrine door. The restraints were gone. The anchor points remained, flush with the deck, small circles of darker metal that the 3 had, without discussion, arranged themselves around rather than on top of. Aishe noticed this. She noticed what people chose not to touch. She lowered herself to the deck, setting the tray between herself and the nearest of the 3, the one she had begun thinking of as the eldest, though she had no evidence for this beyond the quality of attention they directed at her when she spoke. They attended to her the way someone compares what they are hearing to a very large internal catalog. The 3 watched her sit. Their eyes were the thing that had stopped her the first time, segmented, like kaleidoscopes made of polished obsidian, each facet catching the light at a slightly different angle so that the whole eye seemed to shift and refract as they moved. 7 facets in each eye, as near as she could count. The facets didn't blink simultaneously. They blinked in sequence, a ripple across the surface, so that at any given moment some portion of the eye was always watching. Their bodies were lean, angular, built on a frame that was neither bipedal nor anything else she had vocabulary for. Triple-jointed legs that folded in ways her knees actively refused to contemplate. Long torsos with a flexibility that suggested a spine made of many more segments than hers. 6 fingers on each hand, no, 7 on the left. She had miscounted the first time because the 7th was set further back, almost at the wrist, and operated independently. The scales covering their skin were small and iridescent, catching the hold's dim light and throwing it back in muted blues and greens, and, in the eldest's case, a deep amber that surfaced when they were still and faded when they moved. Beautiful. That was the word she kept arriving at and then questioning. They were beautiful the way a river was beautiful. Every part of them moved with a coherence that suggested deep time, long evolution, a species that had been exactly what it was for a very long time. She pushed one of the nutrient slabs toward the eldest. The eldest's 7-fingered hand moved over it, hovering, as if reading something from the surface that Aishe couldn't perceive. Then the hand descended. The slab was lifted. The eldest ate. Aishe ate her own. The session began. She had been approaching their language as a single-channel system because that was what she knew. Every human language she had encountered operated on one primary channel, sound. Yes, there were gestures, facial expressions, the pitch and rhythm of speech that carried meaning beyond the words, but those were supplementary. The core was acoustic. You opened your mouth and shaped air, and the shapes carried the code, and the listener decoded the shapes back into meaning. The 3 did not work this way. She had spent 2 previous sessions, short ones, 20 minutes each, establishing the food ritual and confirming the 30 combined words they shared, assuming that the vocalizations she was hearing were the language, and the posture shifts were body language, and the faint changes in the air she could feel but not see were environmental. She had been wrong on every count. Today she understood why. The eldest vocalized a combine word, kesh, which meant approximately unit or portion or this many. Simple, clear. Aishe knew this word, but as the eldest said it, the second of the 3, smaller, quicker in their movements, with scales that ran to deep blue, shifted the angle of their torso by precisely 3 degrees to the left and raised their 7th finger. And the meaning changed. The vocalization kesh plus the torso shift plus the finger elevation meant something different from kesh alone. This many, which is not enough, and the insufficiency has consequences. Aishe stared. She vocalized kesh back experimentally. The 3 watched. She had no torso shift to add. She had no 7th finger. She had said this many, and they had received this many, and the difference between what she'd said and what the eldest had said was the difference between stating a number and telling a story about what the number meant. She tried the torso shift. She leaned left, approximately 3 degrees. The blue one's faceted eyes rippled, a blink pattern she hadn't seen before. Fast, all 7 facets cycling in sequence. Amusement, surprise. She failed the reaction and moved on. The 3rd of them, the quietest, the one whose scales were darkest, who had shown the most visible signs of nutritional deficit, and who had eaten first and most at every shared meal, made a sound. Low, sustained, with a harmonic undertone that Aishe could feel in her sternum before she could hear it with her ears. And the air changed, not a metaphor, not a feeling, an actual physical change, a shift in pressure or temperature or some quality she didn't have a sensory name for. The fine hairs on her forearms rose. The space between her and the 3 felt briefly denser, as if the air had thickened by a degree she could perceive but not measure. Then it passed. The quiet one had said something. On a 3rd channel, Aishe sat very still. They were communicating on 3 channels simultaneously. She had access to 2 of them, the vocalization, which she could hear, and the postural layer, which she could see. The 3rd was something she could not fully perceive. She could feel its edges. She could tell when it was active. She could not decode it. The honest thing to do was obvious. The temptation to pretend otherwise was equally obvious. She could nod and move on and work with the 2 channels she had, and the 3 might never confront her about it, and the bridge she was building would have a gap in its foundation that she knew about, and they knew about, and everyone would politely ignore. Or, she assembled the combined words carefully. She had 45 now, a vocabulary barely adequate for freight management, hopelessly inadequate for what she was about to attempt, but it was what she had. Tal viz Kirchen Vorka, she said. The combine structure was clumsy, each word a blunt instrument, but the meaning held. I cannot hear all of what you say. The 3 went still, all 3, a simultaneous cessation of movement so complete it was like watching statues remember they had been alive a moment ago. She continued Kirshinda, I hear this part. She pointed to her ear, then touched her throat, sound. She pointed to her eyes, then gestured at the elder's posture, sight, then she held her forearms out, showing the fine hairs that had risen. She touched them. She shook her head. Vorka tel, I am learning. The silence stretched. The eldest's kaleidoscope eyes refracted light across 7 facets, each one catching and releasing it in sequence, and Aishe watched the ripple move from the outermost facet to the innermost, and she knew, with the bone-deep certainty that came from a lifetime of reading Rooms for Survival, that she had just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. They vocalized, 3 words in combine, spoken slowly and distinctly, paired with a postural shift that Aishe could now read as deliberate emphasis, both hands open, 7 fingers extended, torso inclined 4 degrees toward her. Vorka tel, Kesheda, I am learning, and then, good enough. The session's register changed after that. The 3 shifted from responding to her to teaching her, and the difference was immediate and unmistakable, like the difference between a merchant tolerating questions and a craftsman deciding to show an apprentice how the tool actually worked. They had been cargo longer than any of the humans. This emerged over the next 2 hours, built word by word from the shared combined vocabulary, cross-referenced against posture and context. And assembled it the way she had once assembled the story of a family she'd traveled with through the Carpathian passes, from the accumulation of small truths that, taken together, drew a map. The 3 had been on combined ships for, the time unit was imprecise, but working from the feeding cycle intervals she'd catalogued, at least 3 standard combined transit years, perhaps longer, long enough that their combined vocabulary was not the survival minimum Aishe had assembled from PA announcements and crisis exchanges. It was extensive. They knew freight terms she hadn't encountered, feeding cycle terminology, medical terms, a full sub-vocabulary for the procedures the combine performed on cargo, words for sedation and measurement and classification that Aishe recognized as the grammar of captivity refined to an administrative science. They had more combine than she did, substantially more, which meant the sessions didn't just run in one direction. As she taught them to read her postural cues, the human ones, the gestures and facial expressions that supplemented her speech, they taught her the combined words she was missing. The trade was balanced. The bridge grew from both banks simultaneously. Keshfor, inventory count, performed on cargo. Telkir, medical assessment, non-urgent. Da-shen, adequate, meeting threshold. The combine word for this will not generate a report. Vorshen, below threshold, will generate a report. The bureaucratic granularity was staggering. The combine had 14 words for different degrees of compliance and no word for gratitude. Aishe wrote everything down. Her vocabulary list had started as scratches on a strip of composite sheeting she'd peeled from a maintenance panel. Dika had found her a smoother surface, a section of the pale material the combine used for internal signage, blank on one side, rigid enough to take the pressure of the sharpened stylus Aishe had made from a broken restraint pin. The list was organized by category: operational terms, spatial terms, temporal terms, medical terms, emotional terms, a very short column, and now a new category she'd added this morning: relational terms, words for how things stood in relation to other things. The Combine had a rich vocabulary here because bureaucracy was, at its core, a system for defining relationships between entities. Primortes to whom, what belonged where, which things were the same category and which were different. The three taught her Kelthesh, the Combine term for a species cohort, a group of the same kind. The word carried no warmth, it was a sorting bin. Kelthesh, Aishe repeated, pointing at the three of them, then at herself. Two different bins. The eldest tilted their head, a gesture Aishe now understood as acknowledgement without agreement, the equivalent of, I hear you, and the truth is more complicated than that. The blue one made a sound that Aisha's new ear heard as a minor correction, two short notes, descending. A different word, the blue one repeated it with a postural shift, both hands flat, seventh fingers curled inward, a gesture Aishe had seen 3 times now and was beginning to read as intimacy or inclusion. A different word, something closer. Aishe felt the hairs on her arms rise again. The third channel, the quiet one, was contributing something she couldn't decode, but the shape of the contribution felt. Warm was not the right word, but warm was the closest she had. She asked the question at the start of the 4th hour. She had been building toward it, arranging the Combine words in her head the way she would arrange kindling before a fire. The structure had to be right, or the whole thing collapsed. The Combine had a grammatical construction for identity queries used in cargo processing. Quel verdai, approximately, what is the designation? She had heard it on the ship's PA during the initial captivity, spoken by an automated system to each new arrival. It was impersonal, bureaucratic, a form to be filled. She didn't want to use it. The question she wanted to ask was not, what is your designation? It was, what do you call yourselves? She didn't have the Combine words for that. The Combine didn't distinguish between the two concepts because the Combine had never needed to. Designation and identity were the same thing in a system where you existed only insofar as you were classified. So she built it from parts. Quel verdad, she said, first establishing the frame. Then she added, carefully, datel kir, which was not a standard Combine construction, but which she hoped, she specifically, precisely hoped, would shift the meaning from what is the designation assigned to you to what is the name you carry. The three looked at each other. At a glance, they looked at each other in a way that involved all 3 channels simultaneously, sound, posture, and the third thing that made the air thicken and Aishe's skin prickle. The exchange lasted perhaps 4 seconds and contained, she was certain, more information than she could have conveyed in an hour of speech. Then the eldest turned back to her and spoke their name. The sound was layered. That was the only word. It began with a fricative that Aishe's ear could track, a hissing onset like wind through canyon rock. Then it dropped into a register that was partly vocalization and partly something her chest resonated with rather than her eardrums, a harmonic that she felt in her ribs and her jaw and the hollows behind her eyes. Underneath that, the third channel pulsed, and her forearm hairs rose and stayed risen, and the air between them was thick with something she could sense the presence of, but not the content. The posture component was equally complex. The eldest torso shifted through 3 distinct angles during the name, and the 7th finger traced a path in the air that was clearly a symbol or glyph with meaning she could see but not read. The whole thing lasted about 2 seconds. Aishe opened her mouth and closed it. She had been learning languages her entire life. She had bent her throat and tongue around sounds that bore no resemblance to any word she'd grown up speaking. She had learned to make the click consonants of a language she'd heard once, spoken by a traveler from so far south the stars looked different. She had learned to shape the guttural fricatives of the German dialect spoken in the mining valleys where her family had wintered for 2 years. This was different, she tried. What came out was a reasonable approximation of the fricative onset, the wind through canyon part. The harmonic drop was where she lost it. Her throat produced a sound, but it was the wrong sound, flat where theirs had been dimensional, a line drawing of a sculpture. The blue one's eyes rippled. fast, all 7 facets. The quiet one made a sound, low, brief, that Aishe read as gentle rather than corrective. More like not yet. She tried again. Better. The fricative was accurate. She found a way to approximate the harmonic shift by dropping her voice into her chest and letting the resonance build in her sternum rather than her throat. It wasn't the same sound, but it was, she thought, the same shape, like a sketch that captured the proportions, if not the detail. The postural component was beyond her. Her spine didn't articulate that way. Her hands had 5 fingers each, and the 7th was doing something she couldn't replicate. She produced the second attempt and watched their reaction. The eldest tilted their head, the acknowledgement without agreement gesture. The blue one's eyes rippled again, slower this time. The quiet one was still. Close. Still short. Aishe sat with it. She turned the sound over in her memory, examining it the way she would examine a word in a new language, not trying to reproduce it perfectly, but trying to find its center of gravity. Every name had a center of gravity, the syllable or sound or rhythm that, if you got it right, made the rest of the name recognizable even if everything around it was wrong. The fricative onset was the anchor, the hissing wind canyon sound. It was unique. She had not heard anything like it in any human language or in the combined vocabulary. If she held that and simplified everything else into shapes her voice could actually make, she tried a third time, the fricative, sharp and clean, then a simplified version of the harmonic drop, 2 notes, descending, her chest voice doing the work her missing resonance chamber couldn't. The third channel component she acknowledged by going silent for a beat, where it would have been a pause that said something goes here that I cannot make, but I know it exists. It came out sounding approximately like Ikren. The name took 3 attempts. The third attempt was wrong, but it was the wrong shape they accepted, which meant it was close enough to carry meaning. That was the definition of a name that worked. The eldest was still for a long time. 3 seconds. 5. The kaleidoscope eyes did not ripple. Every facet was fixed on Aishe. Then the torso inclined 4 degrees toward her, and both hands opened, and the 7th fingers extended, and the quiet one produced a sustained low tone that made the air thicken one final time, and the blue one repeated the sound Aishe had made, Ikren, in a voice that was clearly an imitation of her imitation, a mirror of a mirror, and the fact that they were willing to hear themselves through her approximation was yay. Aishe blinked hard. Once, she wrote it down. Her stylus moved across the pale composite surface, and the phonetic notation was careful and precise, and beside it she wrote, in the Romani script her mother had taught her, their name for themselves. My version. They allowed it. Ikren. The session lasted another hour after the naming. Aishe was tired in a way that had nothing to do with her body. Language construction at this depth was cognitive labor most people never encountered because most people never needed to build a communication system from raw components with a species that processed information on 3 channels when you only had access to 2. Her head ached. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She had held them still through worse, but the muscles in her jaw were sore from producing sounds her mouth was never designed for. The Ikren, the name felt right already, felt like it had always been there, continued to teach her combined vocabulary during the final hour, and she continued to teach them her postural cues, and the bridge between them grew wider and more stable, and by the time the ship's lighting shifted to the dimmer cycle that Dika had programmed to approximate a day-night rhythm, Aishe had 63 combined words in her catalog and a functional, if limited, ability to conduct a conversation with beings whose communication system she could only partially access. It was at the end, in the dimming light, that the eldest asked, 2 combined words paired with a postural shift as she now understood as a question carrying weight, Vorkastad, where going? As she considered the honest answer, she considered the reassuring answer, she considered the strategic answer. She chose honest. She had always chosen honest when it mattered, because lies built bridges that collapsed under load, and she was building something that needed to hold. "I don't know where," she said, using the combine structure and supplementing with her own gestures, one hand open, palm up, the gesture for uncertainty she'd established in the first session. "I know which direction," she pointed, a human gesture, probably meaningless to them, but she paired it with the combined spatial term kelda, away from the ones who built the cells. The eldest processed this. The blue one and the quiet one shifted, a micro-exchange on all three channels that Aishe caught the edges of but couldn't decode. Then the eldest responded. It was a long vocalization, 10 seconds, perhaps 12. It used combined words Aishe knew, and combined words she didn't, and something that was not combined at all. Fragments of their own language, the one with three channels, woven into the combined framework, like colored thread through rough canvas. The postural shifts were complex and sustained. The third channel was active. Aishe's forearm hairs were risen for the full duration. She understood perhaps a third of it. The rest was shape without content. She could feel its emotional weight, its direction, its urgency, but the specific meaning was out of reach. She wrote it down, every combined word she'd caught, every postural shift she'd observed, the timing and duration of the third channel activity, phonetic notation for the non-combined sounds, carefully marked as untranslated. She would work on it later. She would work on it until she understood it, or until she ran out of time, whichever came first. She stood, her knees protested. 4 hours on a metal deck with no cushion was 4 hours on a metal deck with no cushion, regardless of what species you were learning to talk to. She gathered the tray, now empty. She inclined her torso 4 degrees toward the eldest, mimicking the gesture of acknowledgement the Ikran used. The eldest repeated the gesture back, precisely. Aishe left the hold. The corridor was quiet. The shift that Quintus had organized, the second of 4, running on a cycle that approximated the Roman military watch system, because Quintus was Quintus, and the man could not help building order any more than Aishe could help learning languages, was 2 hours from changeover. Most of the ship was asleep or pretending to be. She leaned against the wall outside the hold and wrote. The phonetic journal was filling up. 3 days of vocabulary acquisition, pronunciation guides, grammatical notes, and now the Ikran naming notation and the untranslated response. She wrote by the corridor's dim amber lighting, the stylus moving in precise strokes, and the ship hummed around her with the bass vibration of systems built to carry freight across interstellar distances, and she realized, not afraid. Tigo was fearless. That was his territory, and she did not trespass on it. She knew the danger. The recovery team was still out there, and 600 people were depending on a ship none of them fully understood, and the nutrient slabs were adequate in the way that a tourniquet was adequate. It stopped the bleeding, but it was not medicine. But she was doing the thing she was for. She had spent her whole life building bridges between things that were not designed to connect, languages that didn't share a root, peoples that didn't share a history, markets where she spoke 3 tongues and none of them were hers. She had thought it was circumstance, the product of a life lived in the margins, where you learned to translate or you didn't survive. She was beginning to think it was what she was for. She closed the journal and pushed off the wall and walked toward the bridge. Quintus was at the command station, studying something on the main display with the expression he wore when he was imposing Roman organizational logic on a problem that predated Rome by several thousand years. Hattori stood at the secondary console, one hand resting on its edge, his posture a stillness so complete it looked architectural. Dika was visible through the engineering corridor, her legs sticking out from under the mass balance console where she spent most of her waking hours. Sevhel was asleep in the corner, sitting upright with his back against the bulkhead and his arms crossed, because the man slept the way he fought, ready to stand up and hit something at any moment. Aishe approached Quintus. "Their name," she said. She used the Kanban word kelvor, name, designation because Quintus had learned 11 combine terms in 3 days through sheer disciplined repetition, and this was one of them. Then she added the human word ikrin. Quintus raised an eyebrow. It was, for Quintus, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Say it again, he said, in the Latin accented combine that was, Aishe had to admit, impressively precise for a man who considered alien language acquisition a logistical task rather than an act of cultural communion. Ikrin, doseis, he repeated it. His pronunciation was flat, Roman, absolutely devoid of the fricative's canyon wind quality. It sounded like a word for a type of masonry. Close enough, Aishe said. Hattori turned from his console. He did not ask Aishe to repeat the name. He had heard it once, and she knew, from watching the man for 3 days, that once was sufficient. His mouth shaped the word silently, testing it, and she saw his throat move through 2 adjustments before he produced it aloud. His version was better than Quintus's. He approached it as a student approaches a master's technique, with precise attention to the details that made it what it was, rather than what it approximated. Ikrin, Hattori said. The fricative was clean. Osha allowed herself a nod. From the engineering corridor, Dika's voice carried with the clarity of someone speaking from underneath heavy equipment. Ikrin got it, adding to the manifest. From the corner, Sevhel opened one eye, said something in Norse that contained the words approximate shape buried inside what sounded like a commentary on the difficulty of pronouncing anything that didn't involve hitting someone, and closed the eye again. She waited for the comedy to settle. Then she delivered the second thing. They have been on combine ships for years, she said. She looked at Quintus. They know about other harvested species, more of their kind, not on this ship, held elsewhere. They know a location. The bridge went quiet. Quintus looked at Hattori. The look lasted 2 seconds and contained, in its compressed Roman economy, a full strategic conversation about priorities, resources, risk, and the mathematics of deciding how much danger you could afford to accept on behalf of people you had just learned the name of. Later, Quintus said, first we survived the next 6 days. The Senkenhand moved on the console edge, one finger tapping, twice. Aishe knew him well enough now to read it. Acknowledgement that later had just been entered on a ledger, and that Hattori would be the one tracking when the debt came due. Aishe returned to her place at the communication station. She set the phonetic journal beside her console, open to the untranslated response from the eldest Ikrin. The combined words she'd caught were there, circled. Keish, unit/portion. Kelda, away from. Vorshen, below threshold. And 3 she couldn't translate yet that sat in the middle of the passage like stones in a river, the current of meaning flowing around them. She would crack them. Tomorrow. Or the day after, or the day after that. She would sit on the metal deck and eat the nutrient slabs and listen on 2 channels and acknowledge the third and build the bridge 1 word at a time, because that was what she was for. And the bridge was not finished, and the people on the other side of it had just trusted her with their name. Gyarvid flew on. Aishe read her notes. The administrative logs of a combine harvest vessel were not designed to be read by the cargo. The logs were formatted for departmental review, quarterly audits, compliance reconciliations, manifest verification, and the possibility that a harvested specimen might access them occupied the same conceptual space as the possibility that a shipping crate might file a grievance. The interface lacked locks, because the question of who might read it had only ever had one answer. Hattori had been reading it for 3 days. He sat in the maintenance alcove adjacent to the bridge, the same alcove he had occupied during his first hours aboard, when he had mapped the patrol routes by listening to footfalls through the wall. The alcove had become his. He had simply been there every time someone looked, and eventually the space had organized itself around him, a terminal angled toward the wall, so the screen could not be read from the corridor, a nutrient slab half-eaten on the ledge beside his knee, a series of marks scratched into the wall composite with a piece of broken drone casing. The marks were his notes. He could not read the Combine script on the terminal. The modern woman had given him access, and the Romani woman had translated the navigation labels, but neither of them had time to sit beside him for hours while he worked through administrative submenus. So he had built his own system. Each Combine character that recurred in the logs got a scratch mark. Each scratch mark got a position relative to the others. Over 3 days, the positions had become a map of the institution that had built the ship. Every institution that has existed for more than a generation develops competing loyalties, he thought, tracing a scratch line with the tip of one finger. The natural accumulation of distinct interests over time guarantees it. The Combine has been operating for 10,000 years. I would be more surprised if it did not have fractures. It has seen this before. Never at this scale. Nothing in the Sengoku period had operated at this scale, but the architecture was the same. 2 families sharing a castle. 2 lords reporting to different superiors. 2 sets of retainers whose loyalties ran through different channels, crossed at the top and diverged everywhere else. The Takeda and the Imagad had shared a border for generations, and the border had not been a line on a map. It had been a gap in the chain of command, a place where orders from one lord did not reach the retainers of the other. Then Yap was where wars started. The Combine's gap was cleaner than anything he had seen on Earth. It was structural, intentional, perhaps, in the way that all bureaucratic redundancies were intentional, built to prevent any single chain of authority from accumulating enough power to challenge the whole. 2 parallel reporting structures on every harvest ship, 2 ledgers, 2 chains of command that shared a hull but not a language, and neither chain knew what the other had written. He had found the discrepancy on the 2nd day. The modern woman's access to the engineering systems had opened the ship's internal communication logs, not the content of messages, which were encrypted, but the metadata, who sent what, to whom, when, through which chain, and what departmental classification it carried. The metadata was formatted as a table. Tables were universal. Hattori could not read the words, but he could read the structure. 2 messages, sent within 3 hours of each other, on the day the bridge had been taken. The first was from the captain's station. It carried the freight command classification header. Hattori had identified the symbol by its position in 17 other logged communications, all of them mundane supply requisitions and course confirmations. The message had been addressed to a destination labeled with a symbol that recurred in every freight-related log, the magistrate's chain. It was the captain's recovery request, the one he had fielded and received no response to. It was still logged as open, unresolved, active. The second was from a different station. It carried a different classification header, one that appeared nowhere in the freight logs. Hattori had cross-referenced it against the full communication archive and found it in exactly one other context: the slaver's reports, the slaver's chain. The message had been sent 42 minutes before the bridge was taken, and it had been addressed to the same regional routing node, but through a parallel channel. Its status was marked with a symbol Hattori had never seen in the freight logs at all. 2 official records, 2 chains, 1 ship. The captain's log said, "The ship requires recovery." The slaver's log said, "The recovery team has been redirected." Neither chain had reconciled with the other. And in the Combine's administrative culture, in any administrative culture Hattori had ever seen, an unreconciled discrepancy was a door. He sat back against the wall and looked at the scratches. The map was clear enough now. He had been building it for 3 days, and 3 days was enough. He closed his eyes and held the entire structure in his mind. 2 parallel lines, connected at the very top, diverging everywhere else, running through every ship, every station, every decision the Combine made. The strength of the Combine was its scale. 10,000 years of harvesting, extracting, processing, filing. The machine was enormous and its weight was crushing. Its weakness was that the machine had 2 engines, and they were unsynchronized. He opened his eyes, picked up the half-eaten nutrient slab, broke off a corner, chewed it, and set it down again. The food had improved since the modern woman had reprogrammed the synthesis matrix, but it was still fuel rather than sustenance. He understood the distinction now in a way he had not understood it in the Sengoku period. In the Sengoku period, he had never gone hungry long enough to forget the difference between eating to live and living to eat. Here, the difference was the entire distance between surviving and having a home. He stood up, brushed his hands on the combine utility garment he wore, walked to the bridge. The Roman was already there. He was always already there. Hattori had observed this with growing respect over the past 4 days. The Roman did not sleep on the bridge. He maintained the same disciplined watch rotation he had imposed on everyone else, but he was always present when a decision needed to be made, as though the ship's rhythms had organized themselves around his internal clock. He stood at the central station with his arms folded, watching the navigation display cycle through its slow stellar parallax, and he turned when Hattori entered with the unhurried precision of a man who had heard the footsteps 30 seconds ago and already identified them. They regarded each other. The Roman said something in his clipped language, a greeting or an acknowledgement or both. Hattori inclined his head. The language barrier between them had become a familiar architecture. They could not speak to each other without the Romani woman's mediation, and yet they had developed a working communication that operated beneath and around language, gesture, timing, the deliberate yielding of a doorway, the strategic placement of a glance. The Roman understood authority as a structural principle rather than a personal attribute. Hattori understood the same thing from a different angle. They had arrived at a shared grammar, if not a shared vocabulary. Hattori touched his own chest, pointed at the navigation display, held up his hand. Wait. The Roman nodded once. Hattori left the bridge and went to find the Romani woman. She was in the medbay, the space that had been a processing station, and was now, through the Romani woman's stubborn occupation, a place where injuries were treated. The man with the electrical burns was there, sleeping on a pallet the Romani woman had constructed from cargo padding. His burns were healing, poorly, but healing. The Romani woman looked up when Hattori entered. She had a quality he had observed in the best interpreters he had known in the Sengoku period, a simultaneous attention to what was being said and what was being meant. She read his face before he spoke. Meeting, Hattori said. The word was one of the combined terms the Romani woman had taught them all, a neutral administrative term that meant something like scheduled gathering for information exchange. In the combine's vocabulary, it had the emotional weight of a furniture requisition. The Romani woman had repurposed it. When? She asked. He held up one hand, fingers spread, then closed them and opened them again. 10 minutes, enough time to find the others. I will bring them, she said. He inclined his head. Hattori, she said his name carefully, the way she said everything, tasting the shape of it, placing it correctly in her understanding. You are calling this meeting not the Roman? It was a reading, not a question. Intelligence, he said, another combine word. The Romani woman had identified it in the ship's administrative vocabulary and recognized its cognate function, information gathered for strategic purpose. That it existed in the combine's language at all told Hattori something about the combine. That the Romani woman had found it and taught it to him told him something about her. She nodded. A quick, warm calculation passed across her features, the code switch he had observed in her between her guarded external face and her perceptive interior. I understand. The Roman will allow it? Hattori allowed himself a thin smile. The Roman understands domains. The Romani woman's eyes glinted. She understood him perfectly. She left. They assembled on the bridge within 12 minutes. The Roman at the central station, arms still folded, but his weight shifted slightly, the posture of a commander who has yielded the floor without yielding command. The modern woman at the engineering console, her eyes already moving between her terminal and the navigation display, cataloging what was different and what was the same. The tracker at the far edge of the bridge, seated on the deck with one leg drawn up, positioned where she could see both the display and the corridor behind them. The Romani woman standing between Hattori and the others, occupying the translation space, the conceptual middle ground through which his words would pass. Hattori stood at the navigation display. The display was cycling through its standard stellar map, the same slow rotation of catalogued systems, trade routes, and threat designations that the modern woman had been studying for days. Hattori reached out and touched the controls. The modern woman had shown him the interface on the second day. The display language was beyond him, but the spatial logic was not. Drag to position, expand to zoom, touch to mark. He cleared the star map. The display went dark. Then Hattori began to draw two vertical lines, parallel, running from the bottom of the display to the top, with a precise gap between them. He drew them slowly, deliberately, using the navigation display's annotation function the way a commander might use a sand table. The lines glowed amber against the dark field. At the top of both lines, he drew a single horizontal connection, one bridge, one point of contact. Below that bridge, nothing. The two lines ran parallel and untouching all the way down. On the left line, he drew three nodes, small circles, evenly spaced. On the right line, three more. The nodes on the left were connected by the left line. The nodes on the right were connected by the right line. No cross connections, no lateral links. The diagram was simple. It was also unmistakable. Two chains of command, connected at the top, separate everywhere else. He let the bridge look at it for a moment. The modern woman leaned forward in her chair. The tracker's eyes moved over the diagram with the same slow scanning attention she gave to terrain. The Roman looked at it and said nothing, but the fold of his arm shifted, a tightening, the way a man might grip a weapon he already knew the weight of. Hattori touched the left line, pointed to the corridor that led toward the captain's station. He spoke one word in the Combine administrative vocabulary, freight. The Romani woman translated the word, the gesture, the context, the implication. Her voice carried Hattori's meaning with precision and without distortion. Freight command, the captain's chain. She pointed to the left line. This is his reporting structure. Captain to freight, magistrate to regional freight authority. Hattori touched the right line, pointing to the corridor that led toward the processing level, the slaver's domain. They spoke another word, court, the slaver court. A different chain entirely, slaver to court assessor, to the court proper. The Romani woman paused. They share a ship, they do not share a ledger. The diagram hung in the air between them, glowing amber, simple as a bone. Hattori touched the gap between the two lines, the fracture, and they spoke through the Romani woman with the unhurried precision of a man who had been building this sentence for 3 days. The slaver's redirect was logged to a different chain than the recovery team order, two official records that contradict each other. Neither chain knows about the other's entry. This is a door. Open. Silence on the bridge. Everyone in the room arrived at the same understanding simultaneously. The modern woman broke it. She was already working. Hattori could see her mind operating behind her eyes, fast and parallel, and relentlessly systematic. "Show me the logs," she said. Hattori had prepared for this. He touched the display and pulled up the two communication records, the captain's unresolved recovery request and the slaver's redirect, side by side, their metadata visible. The classification headers were different. The routing channels were different. The timestamps showed 3 hours apart. The modern woman read them. Her lips moved, processing, not speaking. "The magistrate thinks the ship is still missing," she said. "The court thinks the recovery team was redirected for operational reasons. Neither one has talked to the other." Ristodi nodded once. For 4 days, the modern woman continued, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had worked in organizational systems and recognized this failure mode. Nobody reconciled these logs for 4 days. "The Combine has been operating for 10,000 years, the Romani woman translated from Hattori's next words. Reconciliation happens on audit cycles, quarterly, perhaps annual. The logs will reconcile eventually, but not yet. But not yet. The tracker spoke from the floor. Her words were few. She used the combined vocabulary sparingly, filling the gaps with gesture, but her meaning was precise. She pointed at the left line, then at the magistrate's recovery team tracking data, visible as a moving dot on the navigation display's periphery. 3 days out, closing, the recovery team follows the magistrate's chain, the Romani woman translated. If the magistrate's log were to show a resolution, the ship reclaimed, the situation handled, the recovery team would be stood down. The bridge was very quiet. Hattori let the silence work he had learned in the courts of the Sengoku period, that the space after a statement was where understanding lived. You did not fill it, you did not rush it, you let it do the work that words could not. The modern woman filled it, because the modern woman filled silences the way water filled low ground, irresistibly and with total structural awareness. The codes will flag location. Any combined system that processes a captain's authorization from the ship will check where the ship is, and we're not where we're supposed to be. Hattori looked at her. She had seen the flaw in the plan before he had presented the plan. This was precisely why he had requested her presence. Yes, the Romani woman translated, one word. The modern woman's eyes narrowed. She understood what the one-word answer meant. He had already known. He had been waiting for her to find it. So the captain has to send it himself, she said. From this bridge, with valid codes, from a location that matches the ship's registered heading. For the Dwath. Which it won't? The Romani woman added, not translating now, but contributing. We've been off the registered heading since Pakla set the new course. Hattori touched the diagram again. The single bridge at the top, the one point where the two chains connected. In that the HFY the Roman looked back. His jaw worked once, the muscles tightening and releasing in the way Hattori had learned to read, as the Roman's equivalent of a drawn breath before a decision. Then he spoke, 2 words in his language, flat and military and entirely without ceremony. The Romani woman translated, ask him. The captain occupied the station he had occupied since the bridge was taken, the communications console at the port side of the bridge, angled away from the navigation display. He had not been restrained. He had not been locked in a cell. There had been a brief discussion about this on the second day, which Hattori had followed through gesture and the Romani woman's summaries. The Roman had argued that a restrained prisoner was a liability requiring guards, while an unrestrained cooperator was a resource requiring observation. The tracker had pointed out that the captain had nowhere to go. The modern woman had disabled his remote access to any system that could summon help. The result was a man sitting in a console that could do nothing, in a room controlled by people he had once classified as cargo, on a ship that was no longer his in any way that mattered. He had been cooperating, without enthusiasm. Enthusiasm was not in the captain's register, but consistently, he answered the modern woman's technical questions about ship systems through the Romani woman's translation with the methodical thoroughness of a man completing a debrief. He ate the same nutrient slabs the crew ate. He slept in the same gravity standard increments he had always slept in. He was, as far as Hattori could determine, a bureaucrat whose institution had collapsed around him and who was maintaining his internal procedures because the alternative was formlessness. Hattori understood this. He had seen it in defeated retainers who, stripped of their lord and their purpose, continued to maintain the rituals of service because the rituals were all they had left. The captain was not dangerous. He was lost. Hattori approached him. The Romani woman came with him, and behind her the Roman, not leading but present. The modern woman stayed at her console. The tracker stayed on the floor. The audience was deliberate. This was not an interrogation. Always with a negotiation, and negotiations had witnesses. The captain looked up, his features broad, flat, the muted gray-green of combine standard biology arranged themselves into neutral acknowledgement, administrative attention. Hattori spoke. The Romani woman translated. The words passed through her with the care she brought to moments that mattered. We would identify the discrepancy in your ship's administrative logs. 2 records that contradict each other, one in Freight Command, one in the Slaver Court. The recovery team currently approaching is operating on the Freight Command record. We need you to resolve that record. The captain listened. His eyes moved from the Romani woman to Hattori and back. He understood the translation. The Romani woman's combined vocabulary was sufficient for administrative language, and administrative language was all the captain spoke. Then the captain spoke. His voice was flat, procedural, and precise. The Romani woman translated with equal precision. If I do this, the magistrate's chain will eventually reconcile with the court's chain. When they do, both records will be anomalous. I will be in the anomaly. Hey, padre. The captain looked at the communication device on his station. His hands rested on his thighs. They did not move toward the device. I am already in the anomaly. Another pause. Longer. Hattori held still. The Roman held still. The Romani woman held still. The bridge held still. What exactly am I protecting? The honest question of a man who had realized that the framework he had built his career inside no longer existed, and that compliance and rebellion had become, for him, the same administrative category, decisions made in the absence of a valid superior. Hattori did not answer. He had learned across a lifetime of clan politics that the most powerful answer to a man in this position was no answer. Let him arrive at his own conclusion. Let him own the decision. A man who is argued into surrender will resent it. A man who reasons his way there will commit. The captain looked at the communication device for a long time. Then his hand moved. He touched the console, entered a sequence, his authorization codes. Hattori recognized the input pattern from the administrative logs. The console lit with the amber glow of an active transmission channel. The captain spoke into it, a string of combined administrative language, flat, procedural, indistinguishable from any of the thousands of routine communications he had fouled over a 47-run career. He reported the ship reclaimed. He reported the situation resolved. He used the passive voice because the Combine always used the passive voice. The asset has been returned to operational status. The recovery action is no longer required. The manifest discrepancy has been addressed through standard reconciliation procedures. The transmission went, the console dimmed, the captain removed his hand. He did not look at Hattori or the Roman or the Romani woman. He looked at the dead console, and his face held an expression that Hattori filed with the care of a man who collected such expressions, the face of someone who had outlived the category his decisions used to belong to. According to Sevhel, a recognition not to bow, he returned to the navigation display. The others were already there. The modern woman had been tracking the recovery team's position, and the tracker had risen from the floor to stand beside her. They watched. The recovery team's icon on the display, a small blue marker moving along an intercept heading, continued on its course for 11 minutes. Hattori counted, the Romani woman counted. The modern woman watched the telemetry data streaming beside the icon and narrated in a low voice, speed constant, heading constant, formation unchanged. Then the icon shifted, not dramatically, a gradual course change, the kind of adjustment that looked on a display like a current shifting. The recovery team's heading tilted away from the Arveth's projected position, degree by degree, until it was no longer an intercept course. They're turning, the modern woman said. The bridge did not celebrate. The bridge had no word for celebration in any of the 6 languages present. What happened was smaller and more significant. 5 people and 1 former captor exhaled at the same time. The quiet lasted 4 seconds. We have perhaps 4 days before someone reconciles the logs, Hattori said through the Romani woman. He kept his voice level, the voice of a strategist presenting a timeline. Possibly 5. Our tracker was already at the navigation display. She had been studying it for 4 days, longer than anyone, more patiently than anyone, with the attention of a woman who read landscapes the way others read books. Her hand came up, one finger extended. She wished a sign on the display, a boundary, not a heading, a curved line arcing across the stellar map, marking the edge of the region she had identified days ago, the cluster of 40-odd stars the Combine had marked and then avoided. The line passed through their projected course approximately 4.5 days ahead. "We will be past the boundary by then," the tracker said. The modern woman looked at the line, looked at the tracker, looked at the line again. "What boundary?" she asked. The tracker's finger held steady on the display. The light of the avoided cluster played across her hand, amber and cold blue, the colors of cataloged systems and uncatalogued darkness. He did not look at the modern woman. She looked at what lay beyond the line. "Here," the tracker said, "the Combine doesn't go past this." A pause. Her finger did not move. "I don't know why, but they don't." The line glowed on the display. Bandai, the stars were uncharted. The Arvid flew on. The indicator changed while Sevhel was counting his own heartbeats. He had been doing this for 3 watches now, a trick he'd learned on the crossing to Francia, when the steersman had taught him to measure the interval between waves by the blood in his own wrist. 42 beats between the slow pulse of the display's sweep. 42 beats, the light moved. 42 beats, the light moved again, the rhythm of a thing that did not know it was being watched. He sat in the position the Roman had assigned him, second seat from the left on the raised tier, the one that gave him sight lines to both the main display and the corridor entrance. 5 days of watches, and Sevhel had learned the bridge, the way he'd learned any ship, the geometry, not the workings, where you could see from, where you could not, which surfaces would take weight if you needed to brace, which panels were cosmetic and would give way under a shoulder. The bridge of the Arvid was 3 times the size of any longship's deck, but a deck was a deck. You learned the footing first, everything else came from the footing. The display swept again. 42 beats. Sevhel had not slept in. He did not know exactly. The watches blurred. The Roman had set the rotation at 4 shifts, paired with the freed creatures whose scales caught the bridge lighting in ways that made the air seem to shimmer. Sevhel's shift partner was one of the triple-jointed ones, the tallest, who communicated mostly through a posture language Sevhel was beginning to parse. Weight forward meant attention, weight back meant routine, and the sideways tilt of their narrow head meant amusement, though he could not have said why he was sure of that. His shift partner was in the back weight position now. Routine. Sevhel watched the display sweep. The light moved, and this time, between 42 and 43, something else moved with it. A second indicator, small, at the edge of the display where the sweep thinned into darkness. "It does not be there on the last pass." Sevhel was certain of this because he had been staring at the exact spot where it appeared, counting the emptiness there as part of his rhythm. 42 heartbeats of empty, and now occupied. He did not know what the indicator meant. The display's markings were the flat, angular script of the ship's builders, and while the Romani woman had taught him 7 or 8 of the most common symbols, warning, door, breathe, do not touch, the navigation display used none of those. What he knew was simpler. The indicator was new, and it was moving. His shift partner's weight had come forward. Sevhel looked at the creature. Its segmented eyes were focused on the same spot he'd been watching, and its long triple-jointed legs had shifted into a stance Sevhel recognized from 5 days of shared watches. The one that preceded every corridor seal notification, every time the ship's systems had done something unexpected. The creature's head was not tilted in amusement. Its head was very still. Sevhel stood. He did not run. Running on a ship meant something was already wrong. Walking fast meant you were going to find out what was about to be. He could walk to the corridor that led to the berth section where the tracker slept. Pakla was awake before he reached her. She slept the way Sevhel had seen steppe hunters sleep on the Frankish coast, one layer down from consciousness, surfacing at the pressure change of a footstep in her corridor. By the time he stopped at the partition she'd rigged from cargo netting, she was already sitting up, her dark eyes fixed on his face with the flat attention of someone reading weather. Display, Sevhel said in the combined trade words they shared. He held up one finger, then two, one indicator, then two. The tracker did not ask questions. She pulled on the wrapped foot coverings she'd fashioned from cargo material and followed him back to the bridge at a pace just short of running. A triple-jointed creature was still in its forward-weight stance when they arrived. It shifted toward Pakla and made a sound, low, resonant, the one Sevhel had categorized as "look at this." Pakla looked. The change in her body was immediate and total. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. Her breathing slowed. Her weight settled into her heels like someone planting themselves against a gust that hadn't arrived yet. Sevhel had learned this posture over 5 days of watches. The tracker had seen something she did not like, and she was giving it absolute stillness before deciding what to do about it. "How long?" she asked, in the pidgin of combined words and hand gestures that served as their common language. Sevhel held up 2 fingers and made the gesture for sweep, the display's rotation. 2 passes since the indicator appeared. Pakla leaned closer to the display. Her eyes tracked the indicator's position relative to the Arva's own marker, and Sevhel watched her lips move as she worked through a calculation he could not follow. Then she straightened up and crossed the bridge to the communications alcove where the modern woman slept when she slept at all, which was seldom enough. Sevhel heard Pakla's voice, low and urgent. Then the modern woman's voice, sharp with the alertness of someone jolted from thin sleep. Dika arrived at the display 14 seconds later. Sevhel knew because he was counting. "Recovery team," Dika said. She said it in the language Sevhel did not speak, the modern tongue, and then in combined trade words. "Fast ship, coming for us. Kamado or Singh." Sevhel looked at the indicator. It had moved closer in the time since Pakla had first seen it. The display's scale was enormous, and the indicator's shift was barely perceptible between sweeps, but the direction was unmistakable. Toward them. "Aimda. A ship that does not vary its approach is a ship that expects no response," Sevhel. He had been on ships where the approach was everything, where you read the angle of the incoming vessel and knew, from the way it sat in the water and the timing of its oar strokes, whether it was coming to trade or to kill. Both were dangerous, but the ship that expected no response was the most dangerous of all, because it meant the crew had done this so many times that surprise was not in their experience. He had never in his life been on a ship that expected no response. Something was always throwing a rope or an axe. "How fast?" Pakla asked. Deka was working at the console, her fingers moving through the angular script with the speed of someone who had spent 8 days forcing her mind into an alien grammar. "Faster than us." "Smaller, designed for this intercept and recovery. It's a very expensive net." Pakla looked at Sevhel. He understood the look. "What do you see?" "It turns," he said. He pointed at the display. "Same pause, same turn. I have been counting." Both women looked at him. 42, he said, and held up fingers. "Then it adjusts." He made the gesture, a slight shift, the same direction each time, a correction that repeated with mechanical precision. He had been watching it without knowing what he was watching, and now that the women had given him the context, recovery ship, intercept heading faster, the pattern snapped into the shape of something he recognized. It was a patrol route, a patrol. The recovery ship was running the same search pattern a Frankish coast watch ran when it swept a harbor mouth for raiders. Fixed arc, fixed interval, fixed correction. The route you ran when you believed the thing you were looking for could not possibly be looking back. "Incompletely too of Guy," Deka asked. Sevhel tapped his wrist, heartbeats. Then he held up the piece of cargo netting scrap he'd been using to track the intervals, where he'd been scratching marks with the edge of a broken fastener. 16 marks in neat rows of 4. 16 sweeps observed, 16 identical intervals. Pakla took the scrap from his hand and studied it. Then she looked at Deka. Fixed cycle, Pakla said. Her voice was quiet, focused, already moving ahead of the present moment, a hunter who had found spoor. It runs the same approach every time. Like a river in a worn channel, it does not vary because it has never needed to. Dekka stared at the scrap, then at the display, then at Pakla. Something shifted in her face. I can use this. The Combine doesn't expect cargo to know what an approach algorithm is, Dekka said. The ship is running automated intercept, a standard recovery pattern. It cycles its sensor sweep on a fixed interval because every other time it's done this, the target was a disabled vessel drifting on a predictable heading. We are not drifting, Sevhel said. No, Dekka said. We are not. The next 6 hours were the longest Sevhel had spent on a ship since the 3-day crossing to Miklagard, when the currents had fought them the entire way, and the steersman had slept standing up with his hand on the tiller. Dekka worked the navigation console with the focused intensity of someone performing surgery. Pakla stood at the display and tracked the recovery ship's pattern, calling out each cycle in the pidgin they'd developed. Turn now, correct now, sweep now. Sevhel outwatched from his position and counted. The plan was Dekka's, built from the patterns Sevhel had identified. If the recovery ship's sensor sweep operated on a fixed cycle, there were gaps, moments when the sweep had passed and the recovery ship's systems were blind to a particular arc of sky. If the Arveth changed course during those gaps, quick, sharp adjustments that shifted their position before the next sweep came around, they could thread through the intervals like a small boat slipping past a harbor chain at the change of the tide. Sevhel understood the principle. He had done this in water. The fact that it worked in the void between stars, with machines instead of oars and light instead of waves, changed nothing about the fundamental mechanics. You moved when the watcher's eye was elsewhere, and you were still before it came back. The first course change came 40 minutes into the evasion. Dekka called it. The ship lurched, enough that Sevhel felt it in his legs, the subtle shift in the floor's vibration that meant the engines had changed their song. On the display, the Arveth's marker moved, a sharp lateral adjustment angled away from the recovery ship's projected sweep path. The recovery ship's indicator continued on its cycle. Sweep, pause, correct. The same pattern. It had not seen them move. Sevhel exhaled. He had not been aware he was holding his breath. The Roman arrived on the bridge during the second hour, drawn by the activity or by the instinct that brought commanders to the place where things were happening. He took one look at the display, received Pakla's terse explanation, and positioned himself behind Dekka's station with the stillness of someone who understood that the person at the console was the person in command, and the best thing he could do was be present and silent. Sevhel respected this more than he would have expected. Hattori appeared next, silent as smoke, and stood at the bridge's far edge where he could see everything and be seen by nothing. The strategist's presence was its own reassurance. It meant the political angles were being tracked alongside the physical ones. The second course change came at the 3-hour mark. Dekka had timed it to the heartbeat. The Arveth shifted, harder this time, a course correction that Sevhel felt in his knees, and the display showed their markers sliding through a gap in the recovery ship's sweep pattern, like a fish through a broken weir. The recovery ship's cycle completed and then changed. Sevhel saw it in the display before anyone else because he had been counting, and the count was wrong. The interval between the recovery ship's sweep and its correction had shortened, 3 heartbeats, maybe 4. But the pattern that had been mechanical, unvarying, identical across 16 observed cycles, had altered. It worthiest, and he said. Every head on the bridge turned to him. The last sweep was shorter, he said. He held up his scrap of netting, where the newest mark was scratched noticeably closer to the previous one. 3 beats. It is looking faster now. Dekka's fingers were already moving across the console. Its face had the expression Sevhel associated with someone recalculating under fire, the focused speed of a mind that had just been told the ground rules had shifted. After 30 seconds, 30 seconds during which Sevhel could hear his own pulse. She spoke. The algorithm adapted. The crew doesn't know the algorithm changed. There's about a 30-second gap between what the ship decides and what the crew knows it decided. Sevhel processed this. The ship thought faster than its own sailors. He had never served on a vessel where that was true, but he understood the implication immediately. The ship would adjust first, and the crew would catch up later, and in that catching up was a seam. But the seam was secondary. The thing hunting them was no longer running a fixed patrol. It was reacting, and anything that reacted to you was a different kind of threat than anything that simply searched for you. Then change what it is looking at, Sevhel said. Give it the wrong sea. Dika looked at him, her brow creased, the expression she made when she was translating not just his words, but the concept underneath them, mapping it from the language of water and wood onto the language of sensors and void. The wrong sea, she repeated. If a current reader adjusts to follow you, Sevhel said, choosing his words carefully, using the pigeon's limited vocabulary and filling the gaps with gestures, you do not run faster. You make the current lie. You give it something to read that is not you. Dika's eyes went wide with recognition. So to take him down to the console that began working at a mayday, a bekingness of Sevhel could not follow, her fingers drawing patterns in the angular script that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant something to the ship. The transponder profile, she muttered, half to herself. We already changed the identity, but the mass signature, the drive output ratio, the thermal profile, those are all still reading as a harvest ship because they are a harvest ship. She looked at Pakla. If I adjust the drive output to stagger, pulse it irregularly instead of steady state, the algorithm will read us as something different, something it hasn't categorized. And he thought will that work? Pakla asked. It will confuse the algorithm for about 20 minutes while it recalculates, Deka said. In that 20 minutes, the crew won't know why their approach calculations have changed, because the algorithm doesn't explain itself, it just updates. They'll have to manually review before they can resume intercept. Omain Tinnis, the Roman said, from behind Deka's station. It was the first word he'd spoken. Enough? Reek? Deka looked at the display. The recovery ship was close enough now that Sevhel could see the fine details of its approach vector on the overlay, a predator's geometry, tightening, with one more course change time to the implementation window, enough to open a gap they can't close before whatever's keeping them on this heading changes. Do it, the Roman said. Deka's hands moved. The ship's vibration changed, irregular, stuttering, a heartbeat that had learned to lie about its own rhythm. Sevhel felt it in the soles of his feet and recognized it as the deliberate wrongness that made a steersman adjust his read on the current. You could not fight the sea, but you could make the sea fight itself. On the display, the recovery ship's indicator hesitated, a tiny thing, a delay in the sweep cycle that lasted no longer than a breath. But Sevhel had been counting for 6 hours, and he knew what hesitation looked like in a pattern that had never hesitated before. The recovery ship's algorithm had been fed something it did not expect, and for one brief, beautiful moment, it was uncertain. Now, Sevhel said, Deka made the third course change. The Arveth lurched hard, harder than before, hard enough that Sevhel braced against his station and felt the ship groan in a register that suggested something structural was displeased with the maneuver. But the marker moved, through the gap, past the recovery ship's projected sweep arc, into a patch of display that was dark and empty and blessedly unmonitored. The recovery ship's indicator began a new sweep, but the sweep was wrong. The interval had changed again, and the direction was off by several degrees, and the pattern had the jagged quality of a system trying to reacquire a target it had been confident about 30 seconds ago, and was no longer confident about at all. Sevhel watched it search. He counted. 1 cycle, 2, 3, 4, each one different from the last. The mechanical precision was gone. The patrol route was gone. The recovery ship was hunting now, genuinely hunting, and the difference between a patrol and a hunt was that a hunt meant you had lost the thing you were looking for. 20 minutes passed. Dika sat rigid at the console, her eyes fixed on the display, her hands hovering over the controls with the coiled readiness of someone waiting for the moment when everything went wrong. Pakla stood at the display and tracked every sweep, murmuring intervals to no one in particular. The Roman was a statue of controlled attention behind them both. Sevhel counted. The recovery ship stopped hunting at the 6-hour and 40-minute mark. Sevhel saw it happen in real time. The indicator, which had been running erratic search patterns for the past hour, straightened away from them. A clean course change, smooth and mechanical, the algorithm reverting to purposeful transit, new instructions received, the recovery ship was leaving. Sevhel watched it go. The indicator shrank at the edge of the display, moving with the steady certainty of a vessel that had somewhere to be and was no longer interested in them. It did not pause, it did not sweep, it turned and left, like a hound called back by a whistle no one on the bridge could hear. The thing left the display. He did not know why. He knew it was not coming back today. That was enough. He uncrossed his arms, crossed them again, looked at the scrap of cargo netting in his hand, covered in scratched marks, 32 cycles tracked, the last dozen erratic and uneven, a record of a machine learning that its prey was not prey. He set the scrap down on his station. He would not need it again for this. Around the bridge, the tension drained in stages. Dika slumped forward over the console and pressed both palms flat against its surface, her shoulders dropping as the held breath focus of the past 7 hours released all at once. Pakla stepped back from the display and rolled her neck with the deliberate slowness of someone whose muscles had been locked in position for far too long. The triple-jointed creature, Sevhel's shift partner, settled from its forward-weight stance into something that looked very much like relief, its narrow head tilting sideways, in the posture Sevhel had decided was amusement. Hattori materialized from his position at the bridge's edge and exchanged a glance with the Roman that contained an entire conversation Sevhel could not read but understood the conclusion of. "We survived this one." Sevhel went back to his watch position, second seat from the left, sidelines to the display in the corridor. He sat. He resumed counting his heartbeats. 42, 42, 42, the rhythm of a bridge that was no longer being hunted. 20 minutes later, Pakla said something from the display that made Deka look up. Sevhel watched the tracker trace a line on the display with one finger, the boundary she had identified days ago, the edge of the region the Combine had marked as territory it did not enter. The Arveth's marker was approaching that line, crossing it now as he watched, the ship's indicator sliding across the invisible threshold like a boat passing from river into open sea. On the far side of the line, the display changed. Sevhel had been watching this display for 5 days, and he noticed the angular script annotations that the Combine had scattered across their charts, navigation markers, warning beacons, administrative notations that the Romani woman had translated as things like survey pending and resource extraction scheduled. Those annotations thinned. They thinned like trees at a timberline, growing sparser and smaller until the display ahead of them was mostly dark, mostly empty, mostly unknown. The Combine knew these stars existed. That much was clear from the display. The stars were charted, named in the angular script, given coordinates and relative positions, but the annotations around them were threadbare. No survey data, no extraction schedules, no administrative markers, just coordinates and silence. The modern woman was staring at the star field ahead with the expression she got when she'd found a system she didn't understand, focused in the way of someone whose mind had identified a problem worth solving and was already 3 steps into the work. The Roman came to stand beside her. He looked at the display, at the thinning markers, at the dark expanse opening ahead of them. His face was unreadable in the way it always was. A man who had spent decades commanding other men, and had learned that the commander's face was a tool, not a window. Past this point, Deka said, the Combine's charts get sparse. They know these stars exist. They don't know much about what's around them. The Roman considered this. Sevhel watched him, watched the slight shift in his weight, the way his jaw set, the almost imperceptible nod that was acknowledgement, not agreement. The Roman was calculating something. He was always calculating something. That means we know as much as they do, the Roman said. Deka looked at him, the faintest trace of a smile, the first Sevhel had seen from her since the recovery ship had appeared on the display 7 hours ago. That's exactly what I mean, she said. Sevhel looked at the stars ahead. They were not the stars he had grown up under, not the Great Bear, not the Pole Star, not any configuration he had ever used to find his way home, but they were stars, and they were ahead, and the thing that had been chasing them was behind and gone. For a man who had spent his life on the water, that was a navigable situation. You did not need to know where you were going. You needed to know that you were moving, and that the sea behind you was empty. The sea behind them was empty. The Arveth flew on, past the last thinning marker, into the dark that the Combine had labeled but never entered. Sevhel counted his heartbeats. 42, 42, 42. The rhythm held, the stars moved, and ahead of them the unknown spread like open water past the last headland, vast and unmarked, and waiting for someone to learn its currents. He settled into his seat and watched. The synthesis bay was empty at the gap between rotations, which was why Tigo had chosen it. The Roman had built the feeding schedule the way the Roman built everything, with lines and structure and a certainty that the world would conform to his expectations if he drew the lines clearly enough. 60 people at a time, 3 rotations, a gap of perhaps a quarter watch between the last group clearing the bay and the first group of the next cycle filing in. Tigo ate in the gap. The food itself was indifferent to company. It was what the dark-haired woman, the one who read the machines, had coaxed from the synthesis matrix after 6 days of patient argument with its logic, a warm, dense block the color of clay, faintly grainy, faintly sweet in the way that all the machine's outputs were faintly sweet, as though sweetness were the only flavor it understood with any confidence. It was real food now. The compressed gray slabs of the first days replaced by something that at least remembered what food was supposed to be. The woman had broken through whatever calibration the Combine had set and reprogrammed the output accordingly. Idevi would not have called it food. But it was closer than the slabs had been, the way a rock shaped like a face is closer to a face than a rock shaped like nothing. He ate it the way he had eaten everything aboard this ship. Efficiently, without looking at it, his hands performing the mechanical work of lifting and chewing while the rest of him was somewhere else. That somewhere else was the problem. For 6 days, the crisis days, the days of pursuit and evasion and the rattling howl of the ship's hull under stresses the machine had not been designed to absorb, the somewhere else had been manageable. There was no room for it. When the body needed to fight, the body fought, and the mind served the body, and the somewhere else waited in the dark at the edge of attention like a dog trained not to approach the fire. Titigo had been good at this his entire life. The warriors of the Flower War were not men who did not feel. They were men who chose when to feel. The choosing was the discipline. The crisis was over. The Combine recovery team was behind them. The ship, the Arveth, though Tigo still thought of it simply as the ship, the way a man swept down river does not name the log he clings to, had crossed some boundary that the modern woman said mattered. That the pursuer had turned back, the immediacy was gone, and the dog had come to the fire. Tigo set down the block of not food and looked at his hands. They were the same hands. The scar across the left knuckle, where Makiwa Whittle had turned in his grip during his third Flower War, was still there. The calluses were softening, 6 days without a weapon or a grinding stone or a rope, but the architecture was the same. These were the hands that had ground pigment for the temple painters when he was a boy. that had held his mother's wrists when she taught him to shape dough on the medite, laughing at his clumsiness, adjusting his pressure with her own hands wrapped around his until the motion became part of him. He looked at the block of not food. It was warm and dense in the color of clay. His mother's hands had made something else entirely. The Romani woman came in without announcing herself, which was how she always came in, as though she had been there the entire time and you were only now noticing. She carried her own portion of the synthesis output in one hand and a container of water in the other, and she sat down across from Tigo at the narrow console ledge that served as a table in the bay. She did not greet him. This was one of the things Tigo had come to understand about her in 6 days. She did not perform the rituals of approach unless she believed the other person wanted them. With the Roman, she was formal, because the Roman needed form the way a vine needs a wall. With the Norse giant, she was blunt and warm, because the giant was made of blunt warmth the way the ship was made of metal. With Tigo, she was quiet. She sat, she ate, she let the silence be a shared thing rather than an empty thing. He respected this more than he had words to say. She ate her portion slowly. She had the discipline of someone who had learned that food was not guaranteed and should therefore be honored, even when it was bad. Tanikod recognized this. He had known people who ate this way, the warriors who had come up from the Kalkoli districts where the harvest had been poor, who handled even festival food with careful deliberation. The silence held for a while. Comfortable. The synthesis machinery hummed its low industrial drone behind them, the sound that Tenigo had learned to read as functioning rather than threatening. Bazai's lighting was the same flat amber it always was. The combine did not seem to understand that light could change. The Romani woman finished eating. She set her container of water on the ledge between them. She looked at Tigo with the expression he had come to associate with her, attention. The quality of attention that a healer gives to a wound they have been watching for days, waiting for the right moment to touch. "What did you eat?" she said, in the patchwork of combined words and gesture that served as their shared tongue. "The morning of a flower war." Tigo's hand stopped. He had expected other questions. What is a flower war? Why do you fight that way? What were the gods like? Those were the questions that circled him at a distance, the questions the others were too careful or too disinterested to ask, but that he could feel in the quality of their looking. The Romani woman was asking about what he had eaten, the specificity of it, the smallness. He looked at her, she waited. She had the patience of someone who had learned that asking questions before a person was ready produced silence, and she was giving him the room to decide. He decided. "Ground cold," Tigo said. The words came in Nahuatl first because they were Nahuatl words, and then in the fragments of combined trade language he had been accumulating like a man picking up stones from a riverbed. Food before, woman, stone, cold, morning. The Romani woman leaned forward. Her eyes moved as he spoke, and he understood that she was building the translation in her head in real time, matching his Nahuatl to the gestural and contextual framework she had constructed over 6 days of listening to everyone aboard. She was the only person on this ship who could do this. She was, Tigo had decided, the most dangerous person aboard because she could hear. The stone was cold, he said. She would grind it the night before in Hassa. He had not spoken this much in one stretch since. When? Since the cell. Since the moment he had stepped out of his cell and said "Kuali" to the empty corridor, and a single syllable of satisfaction that the world had presented him with a door and he had opened it. Since then, actions, not words, the body's language only. The Norse giant understood the body's language perfectly. The Roman understood orders and responses. Neither of them required Tigo to do what the Romani woman was now asking him to do, which was to speak from the place where the dog slept by the fire. But the question she had asked was small enough, safe enough. It was about food. "You could hear it from the sleeping room," he said. He made the motion with his hands, the back and forth grinding rhythm of a mano on a mete, a motion so deeply embedded in his body that his hands performed it with the precision of a ritual. The Romani woman's eyes tracked his hands. The sound, the stone on stone. In the dark, the women of the house would grind it while we slept. My mother's sisters, my mother's mother, when she was alive, they ground the maize the night before because in the morning there was no time. He paused. The amber light of the synthesis bay pressed against his skin. The hum of the machinery was nothing like the sound he was describing, but for a moment both sounds existed in the same space inside his chest. In the morning, he said, it was already done. Cold, the shape of a hand. You ate it cold because there was no time to heat it. The drum was already calling. The cold was part of it. I ate it cold every time I went out. The Romani woman did not interrupt. She did not nod encouragingly or make sympathetic sounds. She sat with the same quality of stillness that Tigo himself used, the stillness of someone who understood that being witnessed was a form of respect, and that the witness must not move. The last morning, Tigo said, his hands had stopped their grinding motion. They lay flat on the console ledge, the scar across his left knuckle pale under the amber light. The cold grain, she made it the way she always made it. I ate it the way I always ate it. The drum called, I went out. He did not say, and then I was here. He did not need to. The Romani woman had been taken from her own morning, her own last time, her own version of the drum calling and the cold food and the going out. Everyone on this ship had. The difference was that Tigo's going out had been toward a specific kind of death. The Flower War was combat for the taking of captives, sacred, structured, a negotiation between the warriors and the gods conducted in the vocabulary of blood and skill. Fear was not what the Flower War asked of its warriors. It asked for presence, full, absolute, ceremonial presence. And the cold maze in his stomach was part of that presence, the last mundane thing before the sacred thing, the body's anchor to the world it might be leaving. He had eaten it cold, he had gone out, and instead of the Flower War's resolution, capture, sacrifice, the sun fed, the cycle turning, something had reached down from a sky he had never imagined and pulled him into a cell that smelled of metal and ozone. The drum had called, he had answered. The world had changed its terms without consulting him. He stopped talking. The silence in the synthesis bay was thick and warm and smelled of the machine's inadequate attempt at food. The Romani woman reached across the ledge and placed her hand near his, not touching, but close enough that the warmth was there. She said nothing. She had opened the door. She did not walk through it for other people. The modern woman came in as though she had a purpose, which she usually did. She was carrying a data tablet, one of the flat combine devices she had commandeered and repurposed until it spoke a language she could read, and her attention was on it until she was 3 steps into the bay and heard Tigo's silence. There's a quality to the silence that stopped her. Tigo saw the moment her stride broke, a half step, a recalibration, the awareness that she had walked into something that had weight. Her eyes moved from the tablet to the two of them at the ledge. She wrote to the room the way the Romani woman read rooms, but with a different instrument. The Romani woman read emotion and intention. The modern woman read context and implication. Both arrived at the same conclusion at roughly the same speed. The modern woman set her tablet on the counter by the synthesis unit. She picked up a portion of the output, the same warm, dense block, and she sat down at the ledge, leaving one empty space between herself and the Romani woman. 3 of them at the table. The bay's lighting did not change, because the bay's lighting never changed, but something about the space altered. 3 women, Tigo would have said if anyone had asked him to describe it, except he was one of the 3 and he was not a woman. 3 people, the Romani healer, the modern navigator, the Mexica warrior. From times that the Combine's filing system would not have been able to distinguish 1480, 1487, 2019, 3 numbers that meant everything and nothing, 3 points on a line that the Combine would have classified as Tier 7, negligible, undifferentiated stock. The modern woman ate quietly for a moment. Then she said, in her own language and in fragments of combined trade words woven through it, the language of someone who was accustomed to communicating across barriers and was good at it. I know what that became. Tiwilidiko looked at her. 500 years, she said. She called up 5 fingers, then closed the hand and opened it again. The Romani woman translated the gesture for Tigo with a quick murmured phrase in trade language, many, many seasons, 500 years and a lot of hands later. I ate something in that lineage. She touched her sternum. I, myself, this body. We called it aguali. The word came out round and specific, a word with weight. It wasn't the same. It was cold sometimes, from the night before. She paused. Something moved in her expression that Tigo recognized as the same thing he had been holding, the memory of a specific kitchen, a specific morning, a specific version of cold food eaten before the day's purpose began. We had it cold when there was no time. The room held still. Tigo understood, with the precision of a man who had spent his life reading the language of ritual and pattern, what she was telling him. The food was not the same. 500 years was more than enough to change everything. The grain, the preparation, the hands, the world. But the shape was the same. The cold was the same. The no time to heat it was the same. Something had passed from the hands he remembered to the hands she remembered, through 500 years of hands he would never know about. And it had arrived in a kitchen in a city he had never heard of, and it had been eaten cold. It was very still. The Romani woman watched them both. She did not translate. She did not need to. The bridge between what was and what came after was visible in the two of them, and she was the witness. The modern woman's face changed. Tigo saw it happen, the tension that came into her jaw, the way her eyes moved from his face to her hands, to the wall and back. He had seen this expression before, on the faces of war leaders who had information they were deciding how to deliver. The weight of knowing something that the other person needed to hear but that would change the shape of the world when it landed. I am going to have to tell him, Dika thought. And the thought was not new. She had carried it since the first day, since she had recognized his scarification patterns and his bearing in his language and understood, with the weight of an education she had never expected to use in this context, exactly who he was and where he came from and what happened to his people in the centuries after he left. Not everything, not tonight, but something that is true and does not destroy what he is holding. She looked at the Romani woman. The Romani woman met her gaze and gave the smallest possible nod, permission, or acknowledgement, or simply the recognition that this was happening and could not be prevented. What you came from, Dika said. She chose her words with the deliberation of someone diffusing a device, each selection weighed against the damage it might do. Trade language, fragmented, supplemented by gesture. The Romani woman provided murmured assistance where the grammar broke down. What you came from became something very large. Tigo did not move. It lit marks on the whole half of the world, she said. She spread her arms wide, encompassing, the gesture for a territory too large to walk. The people who came after you, a lot of them, everywhere. She touched the ledge between them, as though mapping something. Your language left traces in the world I came from. Some of it is still spoken. But as she stopped, she did not say, and then men came from across the ocean with weapons your people had never seen, and diseases your bodies had no defense against, and they burned the codices, and pulled down the temples, and ground the civilization to dust, and built their own on top of it. She did not say, the flower wars ended because the cycle was broken by men who did not know it existed and would not have cared if they did. She did not say, I know what your mother's name might have meant. I know the patterns on your skin. I studied your civilization in a classroom 500 years and an ocean away from where you lived it, and what I studied was the ruins. She said none of this. She held it the way you hold something sharp, and she looked at Tigo and she waited. Tigo sat in the amber light of the synthesis bay on a stolen ship between stars that had no names his people had given them, and he processed what the modern woman had told him. His civilization had grown. It had left marks. Something of what he was, the language, the patterns, the shapes of things, persisted in the world that came after. Changed of 500 years of change but present, the way the cold maize preparation was present in the thing she called a gully, not the same but continuous, a thread that had not broken. He had no way to know what she was not telling him. He had no way to know that the thread had been nearly severed, that the continuity she was describing was the continuity of survival through catastrophe rather than an unbroken line. He did not know, and she was choosing not to make him know, and the moral decision she was making was harder than any choice Deka had faced on the ship, including the ones that involved navigation math and transponder codes and evasion trajectories. He will find out, she thought, from a database, from a star chart notation, from one of the 1,000 fragments of information this galaxy contains about what the Combine has catalogued of Earth. He will find out, and it will be worse if it comes from a machine. But not tonight. Tonight she would give him the part that was not loss, the part that said, you mattered, and what you made mattered, and it did not vanish when you were taken. Tigo looked at his hands again, the scar, the softening calluses, the architecture. He said nothing for a long time. Dika stood at the synthesis matrix after. The Romani woman had withdrawn, shifted to the far side of the bay, where she occupied herself with organizing the water containers, performing a task that required her hands and not her attention, leaving the space without vacating it. It was the most graceful exit Tigo had ever seen, and he had watched dancers in the great plaza of Tenochtitlan. He watched the modern woman work. She was programming the matrix with the quick, certain gestures he had observed over 6 days, her fingers moving across the interface the way his mother's hands had moved across the metate. The same quality of practiced intention. The machine responded to her the way the stone had responded to his mother, reluctantly at first, then with increasing compliance, as though the material recognized the authority of someone who understood its nature. She was building something. He understood this the way he understood it when a sculptor began to reveal the form inside the stone, by watching the choices, the corrections, the moments of hesitation and resolution. She was working from what he had told her and from something else, some knowledge she carried in her own hands, her own memory of cold grain eaten before the day began. The matrix produced its output, a dense shape. Not a block this time. She had adjusted the parameters until the machine produced something that was approximately the shape of a hand-formed portion. The color was wrong, too yellow, not enough of the dust-eyed gray that real nixtamalized maize carried. The texture, when she broke a corner off and tested it between her fingers, made her frown. She noted something on her tablet. She would try again later and again after that. This was who she was. A woman who refined, who iterated, who understood that the first attempt was information rather than failure. She brought it to the ledge where Tigo still sat. She set it in front of him. She did not explain it. She did not need to. Tigo picked it up. The weight was close, not right, but close, the way a brother resembles a brother. The temperature was close, cold, because she had programmed it cold, because she had heard him say that cold was part of it, and she had understood. He raised it to his mouth. He ate. The taste was off, a ghost of rightness. The maize had become something in the machine's interpretation that was almost maize and almost not, the way a word in a new language is almost the word you meant and almost not. But beneath the wrongness there was a structure that he recognized, the density, the way it sat in the mouth, the cold. The dog came to the fire and lay down and was quiet. Tigo set the remaining portion on the ledge. He looked at the modern woman who was watching him with fear and hope visible in equal measure. Fear that she had done harm, hope that she had done something else. Kuili Talin, he said. 2 words, Nahuatl. He did not translate them, and the modern woman did not ask. But the Romani woman across the bay heard them and understood enough of the shape to know that the first word was the one he had said stepping out of his cell, Kuili, the simplest satisfaction, and that here, in this context, with the synthesis output cooling in his hands and the memory of his mother's matai in his ears, the word carried a different weight entirely. Good enough, not right, not what it was, but close enough to grieve by and close enough to go on. They walked to the bridge together afterward. Tigo had not planned to. He had not planned anything since arriving on this ship that was not immediate and physical, but they were both going there, and the corridor was the same corridor, and neither of them moved to create distance. The ship hummed around them. The Arveth, the name the modern woman had given it 2 days ago, assembled from 6 words she had solicited from 6 worlds, carried them through the space between stars with the indifference of a river carrying leaves. The overhead lighting shifted from amber to a cooler blue-white as they moved from the lower decks to the bridge corridor, a transition Tigo still found unsettling. Light was supposed to come from fire or sun or moon, and this light came from nothing and served nothing. And Northern woman walked with the gait she had developed over 6 days of shipboard life, efficient, shoulders slightly forward, one hand near the wall in case the gravity fluctuated. She had adapted to this place faster than anyone except possibly the Norse giant, though her adaptation was mental where his was physical. She understood the ship the way the giant understood a fight, as a set of conditions to be read and used. Tigo walked beside her. His own gait had not changed since the cell. He walked the way a warrior walked, balanced, centered, weight distributed for a change of direction at any moment. This ship had not given him a reason to walk differently. He doubted it ever would. At the junction before the bridge door, the place where the corridor widened slightly, where the ship's designers had created a brief architectural breath before the main operational space, Tigo stopped. The modern woman took one more step before she realized he had stopped. She turned, the blue-white overhead light found the planes of her face, and for a moment she looked at Tigo like someone his people would have carved in stone, defined, purposeful, carrying something larger than herself. He said something in Nahua. It was not a word she knew. It was not one of the trade language fragments they shared, not a number or direction or designation. It was a phrase with structure and weight, spoken with the cadence Tigo used for things that mattered, the same register as the prayer she had heard him whisper once, facing the observation port, his lips moving in the dark. She shook her head slightly. I don't understand. Tigo looked at her for a moment. His expression was not the controlled mask he wore on the bridge or the blank efficiency he wore in the corridor. It was open in the way that a door is open, not wide, but unlatched. Something behind it was visible. He searched for the words. The handful of combined trade language they shared was a blunt instrument for what he was trying to say, a vocabulary designed for cargo manifests and operational commands repurposed by the desperate for the work of being human. He found what he could. She, he said in trade language. He touched his chest, the one I spoke of. Who carried? He made a motion with both hands, forward, outward, the gesture for continuing, persisting, not stopping. Carried it forward. She who carried it forward. Dika stood in the blue-white light at the junction before the bridge door and received this. She did not know if he meant the food, the cold maize, the ugali, the threat of grain and hunger, and mornings before purpose that connected his hands to hers across 500 years. She did not know if he meant a civilization, the marks on half a continent, the language traces, the knowledge she carried of what his people had built and what had been done to them. She did not know if he meant something else entirely, something in the Nahuatl original that the trade language translation could not hold. She thought about it for the rest of the day. She thought about it during her watch at the navigation console, tracking the Orveth's heading toward the cluster of stars the Combine had marked as avoided. She thought about it while she ran course corrections and checked the transponder broadcast and monitored the silence where a Combine recovery signal should have been and wasn't. She thought about it while Pakla settled into the adjacent station and began reading the star field ahead with the quiet intensity of a woman who saw terrain where others saw emptiness. She who carried it forward. On the observation port above the bridge, the avoided stars grew incrementally closer, and the Arveth's name went ahead of it into territory no one aboard had mapped, and in the synthesis bay 3 decks below, a portion of not quite right cold maze sat on the ledge where Tigo had left it, cooling toward the temperature of the ship, which was cooling toward the temperature of space, which was as close to nothing as anything could be and still exist. The Romani woman had cleared the other portions and cleaned the containers and left this one alone. It sat there for hours. No one touched it. Eventually the ship's maintenance cycle cleared it automatically because the ship did not understand what it was, and the machine that had made it did not remember making it, and the systems that ran the Arveth were Combine systems built for Combine purposes by Combine engineers who had never once, in 10,000 years of designing machines for the management of cargo, considered the possibility that cargo might grieve. But it had been there, and Tigo had tasted it, and the word he had used, Quali Talain, good enough, was the word of a man who understood that what survives is never what was lost, and that the distance between the two is where you learn to live. He took his position on the bridge. Dike read the stars. The Arveth flew on. The bridge was empty for the first time in 7 days. Pakla had been counting. Her body counted the way you tracked anything that moved through territory. You watched it until you understood its rhythm, and then you waited for the gap in the rhythm, and then you moved into the gap. The gap was now. The tall one with the sharp voice, the one who spoke like a man accustomed to being obeyed by formations, had gone to the synthesis bay 400 heartbeats ago. The modern one had followed him 200 heartbeats after that, rubbing her eyes, muttering in her language about something that sounded like a complaint directed at sleep itself. The quiet one who moved like smoke had passed through the bridge on his way to the lower corridors and had not returned, which meant he was doing whatever he did when he disappeared, watching, mapping, filing information in whatever archive he kept behind those precise eyes. The Romani woman was with the freed ones. The Mexica was standing his vigil somewhere in the belly of the ship, doing whatever it was his gods required of him at this hour. And Pakla was alone with the star chart. She pressed her palms flat against the console's edge and leaned in. The display was the width of a buffalo hide stretched for tanning, and it glowed with the Combine's orange-yellow notation, dense clusters of marks where their ships moved frequently, thin trails where they moved occasionally, and spaces where they did not move at all. For 7 days, Pakla had been reading this chart the way she had read the high plains since she could walk, as a story told by what moved through a place and what didn't. Every territory told you 3 things if you knew how to listen: where things went, where things stopped going, and where things went and didn't come back. The Combine's marks were all 3. She traced her finger along the dense region they had come from. The area she now understood was the Combine's operational center, a web of routes that spoke of regular transit. Traffic, patrols, ships that moved like buffalo, moving between established grazing grounds, the same routes, the same timing, worn into the terrain by repetition so deep it became instinct. Past that web, the marks thinned. Unevenly, they thinned in specific directions, at specific boundaries, and the unevenness was the story. Some thinning was natural. The edge of mapped space, the frontier beyond which nobody had gone because there was nothing worth going toward. That kind of absence was empty. It had no weight. But there was another kind of thinning. Southeast on the display, or what Pakla had decided to call southeast, because the chart needed directions and her mind supplied them. A cluster of roughly 40 stars sat in a region where the Combine's markers didn't thin gradually. They stopped cold, the way tracks stopped at the edge of a canyon that had swallowed the thing making them, the way a game trail stopped at the tree line where the thing that hunted the game had its den. The marks hit an invisible line and went no farther, and the line was deliberate. The Combine's marks thin here the way trails thin near a place where something went wrong, Pakla thought, letting the observation settle into her the way a good read always settled, in the body's certainty, the tracker's sense that what the ground was telling you was true. They know it is there. They go around it. I have seen this in every territory I have ever tracked. A space the predators leave alone is a space something else has claimed. She leaned closer. The display responded to her proximity, the resolution sharpening. Inithamewatselv posture, the absence wasn't total. She could see, if she looked at the spaces between the stars the way she'd look at the spaces between trees for sign of passage, old markers, 3 of them, maybe 4, combined notation that had entered the cluster at some point in the past and never appeared on the other side. But whatever had gone in had not come out. Pakla breathed slowly through her nose. The ship's air still tasted wrong, metallic, too thin, as if the sky had been wrung out, like a hide left too long in the rain. But she had stopped noticing the wrongness on about the 3rd day. Now it was simply the air, her air, the air of the territory she was learning to read. She studied the 4 dead markers. Their placement told her something. They hadn't entered from the same direction. 3 came from different points along the combine boundary. 1 came from deeper and mapped space, as if it had traveled a long way specifically to reach the cluster. All 4 stopped inside the boundary. None were at the same location. That meant the thing in the cluster, whatever it was, didn't just sit at the edge and wait. It was distributed. It occupied the whole space. It responded to intrusion from any direction, territory behavior, a thing that had marked its ground and defended it. Pakla felt a hum of professional interest, the focused, clear-headed recognition that the terrain ahead had something in it that would change the shape of every decision that followed. A tracker who feared what she found wasn't a tracker long enough to matter. This was interest, this was reading. She pulled her hands from the console and straightened. The bridge was still empty. The ship's ambient sound, the low thrum of the drive, the cycling whisper of the air system, the occasional distant clang of something in the lower decks, wrapped around her like wind through prairie grass. 7 days of running, 7 days of a heading the modern one had set, because it was away from where they'd been, and away was the only direction that mattered when you were being chased. But the pursuit was behind them now. The gap between the Arveth and the recovery team had widened to something the tall commander had called operationally comfortable in his clipped, dry voice, and the Romani woman had translated into something the others could understand. They had been running away. It was time to run toward. Pakla left the bridge. The Romani woman was in the lower corridor that the freed ones had made their own, a stretch of passageway near the cells where they'd been held, which Pakla found deeply strange. Like a horse that chose to stand near the corral fence after the gate was open, but Pakla had seen humans do similar things. Sometimes the territory you knew, even if it had caged you, was less frightening than the territory you didn't. She found the Romani woman sitting cross-legged on the deck, plating outside one of the open cell doors, speaking quietly with one of the scaled ones. The freed one's triple-jointed legs were folded beneath it in a posture Pakla had learned meant attentiveness, its segmented eyes catching the overhead light and shifting prisms that made the whole hallway look like the inside of a cave with minerals in the walls. Its 6 fingers moved in small patterns as the Romani woman spoke, and occasionally it responded in the pidgin language they'd built, combined words stripped to roots, shared between species. Pakla stopped at the corridor junction and waited. The Romani woman didn't look up immediately, which was unusual. Aishe generally noticed everything that entered a space she was in. Instead, she finished her sentence to the scaled one, listened to its reply, nodded, and then turned. Her eyes found Pakla's. Her expression shifted, recognition, the way one reader of rooms acknowledged another. Pakla inclined her head toward the bridge. The Romani woman held up one hand, a moment, and spoke quietly to the scaled one. It shifted its weight forward on its folded legs in a gesture Pakla had learned was acknowledgement, or possibly farewell, or possibly both. The Romani woman stood, brushed her hands against her thighs, and came. They walked in silence. Pakla did not feel the need to explain, and the Romani woman did not feel the need to ask. This was one of the things Pakla valued about her. She understood that information arrived at its own pace, and pressing it to arrive faster only made it arrive wrong. The bridge was still empty when they returned. Pakla went directly to the nav display and brought up the chart she'd been studying. The orange-yellow markers populated the display like campfires on a dark plain, bright and clustered in some places, sparse in others, absent where it mattered. She pointed at the avoided cluster. Then she looked at the Romani woman. As she stepped closer to the display, her brow furrowed. She was matching what she saw against something she already knew. Her lips moved slightly, as if she were counting or translating, and then she placed her own finger on the display. Her finger landed inside the avoided cluster, offset from the center, toward the boundary where one of Pakla's dead combine markers had stopped. A specific point, a location that had been given, not guessed. Pakla looked at the point. Then she looked at the Romani woman. Aishe spoke quietly. She used the combine words they had in common: stripped, functional, the bare vocabulary of captivity, and supplemented with gesture. The freed species had given her a location, a system where others of their kind were being held, a place they needed to reach. The place was here. Inside the cluster the combine would not enter. Pakla looked at the display. The Romani woman's finger sat among Pakla's dead markers like a seed planted in scorched ground. Two completely different paths to the same point, Pakla reading the absence in the combine's navigation and the freed ones providing a coordinate from their own intelligence. Both converged. She made a sound, low from the back of her throat, the sound a body makes when something it suspected becomes something it knows. The sound of a tracker finding the track she'd felt in the ground before she saw the print. The Romani woman looked at her. Pakla touched the display where both readings overlapped. One place, two reasons to go there, neither of which knew the other existed until this moment. That meant there was a third reason neither of them could see yet. Pakla had been tracking long enough to trust converging sign even when she couldn't explain the convergence. When two independent trails led to the same water, you didn't ask why the water was there. You went to the water. She turned from the display and looked at Aishe and said the only word that mattered. All. A worded meaning, bring everyone. The bridge had not been designed for gatherings. It was a working space built for a crew of 6 or 8, with fixed stations that assumed the operators would stand at them and not wander see it. The combine had not accounted for the possibility that 11 beings, 7 humans from 6 different worlds and 4 freed ones from another, would need to stand in a rough circle around a single display and look at the same thing. They made it work the way they had made everything work on this ship, by being too large for the space and not caring. The tall commander stood to Pakla's left, his arms folded across his chest, his expression the mask of disciplined neutrality she had learned meant he was processing quickly, behind eyes that gave nothing away. The quiet one with the smoke movement stood beside him. Always beside him, Pakla had noticed, the way a second blade sits next to the first in a sheath. They operated as a pair that had never been introduced but had recognized each other's function on first sight. The modern one was at the engineering console, where she always was, her fingers already moving on the controls as if she knew that whatever Pakla was about to point at would require calculations. The Norseman stood near the bridge entrance with his arms at his sides and his weight on his forward foot, which was the posture he maintained at all times, ready for something to become a problem that his body could solve. The Mexica stood beside him, motionless, his eyes on the display. The Romani woman took her position to Pakla's right, between the humans and the freed ones. The largest of the scaled ones, the one who spoke for the group, as far as Pakla could tell, through willingness rather than authority, stood in the doorway. Its iridescent scales caught the bridge lighting and threw fractured color across the near bulkhead. Its segmented eyes tracked the room. Pakla waited until the last body settled. Then she turned to the display. She pointed, here, one word, one gesture, her finger on the avoided cluster. The bridge was silent for 3 heartbeats. Then the voices began. The tall commander spoke first naturally, because command spoke first when it identified a tactical opening. His voice was clipped and measured, the words Pakla didn't fully understand but had learned to read by cadence. The freed species representative confirmed through Aishe. The coordinates were genuine. The source was their own people's knowledge of the holding network passed between captives across generations of captivity. The information was old but durable, the kind of knowledge that survived because it was too important to lose. The tall commander's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted forward by a fraction. The way a general leaned toward a map when the intelligence confirmed what the scouts had reported. He asked one more question, and it was the question Pakla would have asked if she'd had his vocabulary. What is there that the Combine avoids? Nobody answered because nobody knew, but the absence of an answer was itself information, and everyone in the room understood that. Then the quiet one spoke. His voice came through the Romani woman's relay, combined words stripped to function, but his meaning was precise as a blade laid flat against a whetstone. Pakla watched the Romani woman's face as she translated, saw the slight lift of her eyebrows that meant the words had landed well. The Combine avoids it, the quiet one said, and the Romani woman carried the sense of it into the bridge air. That is either because something there is dangerous, or because something there is stronger than the Combine wants to engage. Both are useful to us. Pakla let those words settle. They were correct. They were also incomplete. The quiet one was thinking in terms of alliances and leverage, which was his way of reading terrain. Pakla was thinking in terms of what the land itself was doing, and the land was telling her that the avoided cluster was occupied, defended, maintained, a place that had been held against the Combine long enough for the Combine to build avoidance into its root structure. That kind of permanence was deliberate. That was territory held by something that understood what territory meant. The modern one's voice cut through from the engineering station. As she had been working while the others talked, her fingers on the console, the nav display responding to her inputs with route calculations and distance estimates. She spoke in her own language and then repeated the key figures in the clipped Combine vocabulary she'd been building. 6 days at the current drive setting, maybe 5.5 if I push the mass balance one more adjustment. 6 days. Pakla felt the number land in her body the way distance always landed, as a physical reality. 6 days of travel through territory she couldn't see in advance. 6 days during which the ship would be crossing from mapped space into whatever lay beyond the boundary the Combine had drawn for itself. The freed species representative spoke, not through the Romani woman this time, directly in the Combine pidgin, its voice a low harmonic that resonated in Pakla's chest the way thunder resonated in the ground. The words were simple. The weight behind them was immense. The Romani woman translated, but she did it slowly, as if the weight needed time to transfer. What the freed one had said was something like yes, an affirmation, a confirmation that this was where they needed to go. But the word carried more than agreement. It carried the gravity of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this question to be asked and this direction to be chosen. Yes, the way water says yes when it finally finds the channel it's been pressing against for years. Inevitability. Pakla looked at the Mexica. He had not spoken. He had not moved. But his posture had changed. She could see it clearly, the way she could see wind change direction on the grass before the grass moved. He had been standing at rest. Now he was standing at attention, not the kind of attention the tall commander demanded from a formation, the kind a warrior gave to a path he had decided to walk. His weight had shifted forward, his shoulders had settled. His eyes were on the display, on the point where Pakla's finger had been, and in them was absolute certainty that the direction was correct, arrived at through the body's knowledge of where it needed to go. They said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The tall commander looked around the bridge. He read the room the way he read everything, quickly, completely, with the economy of a man who had been making command decisions since before most civilizations in this room had existed. He asked no further questions. He gave no speeches. He confirmed the course. His voice carried the weight of finality, and the bridge accepted it the way ground accepts a footprint. No one objected. Pakla stepped to the navigation console. The modern one was already there, her hands moving on the controls with a fluency she'd built over 7 days of study. She looked up at Pakla, and between them passed the understanding that had been growing since the first time they'd stood at this console together. Pakla read the terrain, and the modern one turned the reading into numbers the ship could follow. Neither was complete without the other. Neither needed to say so. The modern one brought up the heading input. The display showed their current course, the straight line the modern one had set on the first day, the line that meant away, and the destination Pakla was about to replace it with. A point inside the avoided cluster, a specific system, a place where two independent readings converged. Pakla reached for the controls. Her hands knew what to do. She didn't understand the technology, not the way the modern one did, not the mechanics of how the ship translated an input into a trajectory, but controls were tools, and tools told you how they wanted to be held if you listened. The heading input was a physical interface, a set of markers on the display that you moved with your fingers. She had watched the modern one set the original heading. She had practiced on the secondary display during the quiet watches. She knew the gesture. The ship wants to go toward the star cluster, she thought as her fingers found the markers. There was a pull in the navigation. She'd felt it since the third day, a subtle bias in the ship's default heading that tugged toward the dense Combine core. The ship had been built by the Combine, for the Combine, and its bones wanted to return to Combine space the way a horse raised in one valley wanted to return to that valley when you let the reins go slack. I am choosing against what the ship wants. I have always chosen against the expected path when the expected path is someone else's design. She moved the markers. The heading shifted on the display, the line rotating away from the Combine core, away from the default pull, toward the sparse edge of map space and the avoided cluster beyond it. I know where we are going. I know it is the right direction. The modern one checked the numbers. Her lips moved as she ran the calculations, distance, speed, the mass balance adjustment she'd mentioned. Her fingers made small corrections on the engineering console. Then she looked up and nodded. The heading was set. Pakla took her hand off the controls and felt the ship respond. Not immediately, not the way a horse responded to a shift in your knees with that living recognition of intent, but slowly, ponderous as weather, the Arveth's drive adjusted to the new course. She felt it in the deck plating under her feet, a change in the vibration's character, the ship leaning into its new direction. 6 days, the tall commander moved immediately to what came next, because that was his nature. The crisis of direction was solved, so the crisis of transit needed structure. He began speaking to the quiet one and the Romani woman in the rapid exchange that meant he was organizing something, and within the span of a few hundred heartbeats, the shape of it became clear, a watch rotation, the first fully structured one of the voyage. Pakla had seen men organize sentry schedules before. On the plains, when a band made camp in contested territory, there was always a rotation, always someone watching while others slept. The tall commander did it the same way, with the same underlying logic: pair the experienced with the new, cover all directions, make sure no watch was so long that attention dulled. But he added something Pakla hadn't seen before. He paired humans with freed ones. Each watch would have at least one of each. The freed ones had their own competences, their own alertness, but the Romani woman's translation capacity was a finite resource, and if something happened during transit, the watch team needed to be able to communicate, at least in the stripped-down pidgin, without waiting for a relay. Pakla approved. It was the logic of a man who understood that communication was terrain, and you couldn't cross territory you couldn't read. She watched the rotation take shape. The tall commander assigned watches with the economy of long practice, reading each person's strength and placing them where they could use it. The Norseman got the longest watch, the deep night stretch when alertness mattered most, and his capacity for sustained vigilance was an asset. The Mexica took the watch before it, the liminal hours. The quiet one took the overlap watch, the one that covered the transitions. Pakla herself drew the first watch, the one that started now. The modern one did not get a fixed watch. She got something else, a roving assignment, the freedom to be at the engineering console whenever she was needed, which was always. The tall commander recognized what Pakla had recognized on the first day. The modern one's value was in understanding the ship, and you didn't tie your best tracker to a sentry post when the whole territory needed reading. The rotation settled. The freed species representative communicated it to its own people through the Romani woman's relay, and the acknowledgement that came back was the same as the affirmation earlier, simple in word, heavy in weight. They understood, they would participate. They had been waiting for this kind of structure, the kind that said you are part of this, not carried by it. The modern one had already turned away from the rotation discussion. She was at the engineering console, her hands moving on the controls, building something new. Pakla watched from her station, close enough to see the display, far enough to not interfere. Communication protocol. The modern one was building a system for talking to whatever they found at the other end of the transit. Pakla didn't understand the specifics. The interface was dense with notation that meant nothing to her, but she understood the intent. The modern one was preparing to speak before she knew the language, which was wisdom. You'd learn the language faster if you had already built the framework for it. The Romani woman spent the next stretch of time moving between the bridge and the lower corridors, briefing the freed species on where they were going and why. Pakla could hear her voice filtering up through the deck, the warm cadence of it, the way she shaped the combine pigeon into something that carried more than information. She was carrying assurance, telling the freed ones, "We are going toward your people. We have chosen this. You are part of the choosing." Pakla settled into her watch. The bridge emptied gradually. The tall commander left with the quiet one, both headed for rest before their own watches began. The Norseman went to the corridor outside the bridge, occupying the threshold the way he occupied every space, with the suggestion that anything entering would need to go through him first. The Mexica descended into the ship's lower levels, his footsteps precise and deliberate on the deck plating. The modern one stayed. She was always the last to leave the bridge, and tonight she would not leave at all. The communication protocol was consuming her attention with a totality that Pakla recognized as the trance of meaningful work. They shared the bridge in silence. Two women from different worlds, different centuries, different languages, reading the same sky. The nav display showed the new heading, a line stretching from where they were to where they were going, crossing the boundary of mapped space and entering the avoided cluster. 6 days of travel through territory no one on this ship had ever seen. 6 days during which they would leave the last edge of known ground and move into whatever waited beyond it. Pakla read the display the way she had read every horizon she'd ever studied, with the focused, patient attention of a woman whose skill was knowing what the terrain would do before the terrain did it. The avoided cluster sat ahead of them, 40 stars in a pattern that Pakla had learned to read as occupied, defended, maintained, old combine markers that had gone in and not come out, a coordinate the freed species had carried through generations of captivity, a convergence of independent sign that pointed at a single destination. Something was there. Something that had held territory against the Combine long enough to become a permanent feature of the Combine's avoidance map. Something that was in the oldest and most fundamental sense of the word, home to the freed ones aboard. The ship hummed. The stars moved. The heading held. Pakla sat in her station with her back straight and her eyes on the display, and her weight settled into the chair the way she would settle into a ridge overlooking unfamiliar country, ready, patient, reading. The terrain ahead was dark. That was fine. He had always done her best tracking in the dark. The engineering station hummed at a frequency Deka had learned to read like a pulse. Steady meant nominal. A warble in the upper register meant the portside thermal exchanger was cycling heavy. A low throb meant the reactor was hungry, and the fuel feed algorithms were doing that thing where they argued with themselves for 6 seconds before agreeing on a flow rate. Right now, steady. The ship was breathing easy. She checked her internal clock, the one she'd been keeping since day one, counting off hours by habit, because the Combine didn't believe in circadian rhythm, and the ship's lighting never changed. The overhead panels held that constant sodium orange, the same flat industrial glow, whether it was the middle of a watch or the dead hours between them. No dimming, no warming toward amber in the evening the way the light in her apartment in Nairobi had shifted when the sun dropped behind the Nyung Hills, just the same relentless output, hour after hour, as if the Combine had looked at the concept of day and night and decided it was an inefficiency. 18 hours since her last sleep cycle, 6 hours since the last watch rotation, approximately 0300 ship time by the consensus clock the tall commander had established for the watch schedule. The bridge was empty except for her. The watch rotation said it shouldn't be. The scarred one and one of the freed species were supposed to be on until 0600, but the scarred one had been nursing a pulled muscle in his left shoulder for 2 days, and she'd sent him to the medical bay an hour ago. He resisted the way he always resisted anything that required him to admit his body had limitations, standing at his station with his left arm held slightly away from his side, as if the shoulder would fix itself if he just refused to acknowledge it loudly enough. She pointed at the door. It gone. The freed species had followed, because the freed species followed the scarred one everywhere now, which was either loyalty or the fact that he was warm-blooded and they were cold-blooded, and he radiated heat like a ceramic stove. So, alone, the transponder interface glowed on her secondary display. She'd had it open for 3 days. She hadn't been working on it, just looking at it. The way you look at a door you know you're going to walk through but haven't decided when. The cursor blinked steadily in its empty field, patient as a machine could be, which was to say infinitely patient, because patience implied awareness of time passing, and the cursor was not aware of anything. It just blinked. On, off, on, off. It had been doing that for 72 hours, and it would do it for 72 more and 72 after that, and it would never once wonder why the field was still empty. I have been calling the ship for 8 days. That was fine while we were running from something. We are going towards something now. It should have a name before we arrive anywhere. The process itself was simple. The captain, who was still technically alive and technically on the bridge during daylight hours, sitting at his former station with the energy of a man who had been asked to train his replacement and understood that his severance package was not being killed, had walked her through it on day 3. He'd done it with the meticulous cooperation of someone who had precisely calculated the survival value of being useful and the survival cost of being difficult, and had decided to be useful with such thoroughness that it occasionally circled back around to a kind of passive aggression. Authorization codes? She had those pulled from the bridge lockout override during the takeover. Registration matrix, a template system designed so that any Combine dock officer could update a ship's identity without understanding the underlying architecture. Broadcast configuration, 3 fields, registry number, classification, name, the registry number she'd already changed. The old one, a string of Combine alphanumerics that translated roughly to harvester class freight, regional assignment, sub-tier biological transport, was gone, replaced with a number she generated from the ship's own reactor signature. It would read as legitimate to any automated system. It would not match anything in any Combine database. That was the point. The classification she changed to independent trader. Independent traders were the background noise of Combine space, thousands of them, mostly automated, mostly beneath notice. The Combine didn't track them individually, they tracked them statistically. One more blip in the statistical noise was invisible. One fewer harvest ship in the regional fleet was a paperwork problem someone would eventually notice, but not today, and not tomorrow, and probably not for another 30 days, because the Combine's asset reconciliation cycle ran monthly, and the ship had been due for a maintenance rotation anyway. She'd learned that from the captain. He told her with the flat affect of a man explaining how his own house could be burgled. She'd thanked him. He'd stared at her like gratitude was a system error. So, registry done, classification done, name blank. The cursor blinked in the name field. It had been blinking for 3 days. Deka leaned back in the chair, the one she'd adjusted on day 2, by jamming a folded nutrient slab wrapper behind the lumbar support, because Combine ergonomics were designed for a species with a different spine, and she was not going to spend 6 months with her lower back screaming at her. And looked at the field. A name. She could pick one. She could pick anything. The system didn't care. It was a text field with a 40-character limit and no validation logic. She could type "burn the Combine" and the transponder would broadcast it faithfully into the void, and every automated relay station would log it without comment, because automated relay stations did not have opinions. But she didn't want to pick one alone. She'd been making unilateral decisions for 8 days, and nobody had objected, mostly because she was the only one who could read the displays. But this one felt different. This wasn't an engineering decision. This wasn't which valve do I open, or what frequency do I broadcast on, or how do I make the nutrient synthesizer produce something that doesn't taste like compressed sadness. This was identity, and she'd learned in her 26 years on Earth and her 8 days in space that you don't build identity alone. You build it in committee, badly, with arguments. And the result is always worse than what any individual would have chosen and better than what any individual deserves. She reached for the bridge intercom. The Nanicha tossed. It was 0300. People were sleeping. Some of them had not slept well in 8 days and were only now beginning to close their eyes without one hand on a weapon. Waking them up to ask what to call the ship was, she thought about the woman from the Comanche Plains, how the tracker had spent the first 2 nights sleeping in a crouch against the bulkhead, one hand flat on the deck as if reading vibrations through the metal. She thought about the strategist who slept the way he did everything, economically, in controlled intervals, waking without transition as if sleep were a duty shift he'd completed. She thought about the big Norse one, who didn't sleep so much as hold still for a few hours before getting up to check the corridor outside whatever compartment he'd claimed, pacing its length like a wolf circling a den before lying down again. They needed sleep, all of them did. She pressed the intercom anyway. What should we call the ship? Her voice came out flatter than she'd intended, the 0300 energy stripping the question of ceremony. I'm doing the transponder now and I need a name. The intercom crackled. Cillians. She imagined the sound reaching through the corridors, into the sleeping quarters they'd carved out of former containment bays, into the maintenance alcoves where some of the freed humans still preferred to sleep because the alcoves were small and enclosed and felt safer than open space. The intercom speakers were everywhere. The Combine had designed them for ship-wide announcements about cargo handling procedures, not for midnight polls about nomenclature, and the sound of her voice would have reached every inhabited section of the ship, bouncing off the bare metal walls and into whatever fragile architecture of rest 600 people had managed to build for themselves. She added, because she did feel slightly guilty. I know it's early, or late, take your time. More silence. The bridge hummed around her. She could hear the soft tick of the thermal regulation system in the overhead, and beyond it, the deeper resonance of the reactor. Not a sound, exactly, but a presence, the way you could feel a large engine idling in a building, even when it was 4 floors below you. The ship was alive in the way machines are alive, persistent, full of processes that continued whether or not anyone was watching. Then a voice came through, deep, rough, speaking in a language she didn't understand but had learned to recognize by its cadence. Norse. The big one, the one who had broken the first cell with his bare hands and had not, as far as she could tell, slept for more than 4 hours at a stretch since. The words were short, a compound from the sound of it, two syllables jammed together with the force of a fist hitting a table. He sounded groggy. He also sounded like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She'd heard him use it when he talked about things that had tried to stop him and hadn't succeeded. There was a pride in it that had nothing to do with boasting, factual pride, stated flatly, the way you'd say the river is deep or the winter was long. Something that means it did not stop when it should have. She wrote it down. She couldn't spell it, so she wrote a phonetic approximation and the meaning she'd read from his voice. She used the engineering stylus on the secondary display, the one she'd been using for her star annotations. The letters were blocky. They looked like they belonged on the wall of a cave. The next voice came faster. Latin, clean clipped, dry in a way that made everything sound considered, weighed, and found adequate. The tall commander. He gave her a phrase, not a single word, 3 syllables, maybe 4, with the cadence of a place name. She heard it and knew, without understanding the language, that it was somewhere he'd been, somewhere he'd returned from, when the odds said he shouldn't have. The way he said it, unhurried but precise, as if the name were being placed on a surface rather than tossed, told her it was a word he'd carried for a long time. A word that had been in his mouth before she asked. She wrote that down too. A longer pause, then a voice she recognized by its silence before the words arrived. The tracker. When the tracker spoke, there was always a space before, as if she were checking the wind direction of the conversation before committing. The language was Comanche, and the word was longer than she'd expected, with a rolling middle syllable that sounded like open ground, like the word itself was a landscape, flat and wide with something moving across it. She couldn't parse the meaning directly, but the tracker's voice carried dark humor, the sound of someone describing a path you wouldn't choose if you had options, but you didn't have options, so you took it, and it turned out to be the right one anyway. The path that goes where the horse doesn't want to go. She wrote it. The display was filling up. 6 words from 6 languages, none of them agreeing, all of them arguing for the same thing from different directions. The engineering stylus left faint trails on the display surface between entries, ghost lines from her hand moving, and she didn't wipe them. They looked like connections. They looked like the map she was building of the sky, provisional, incomplete, hers. The next voice came in a register that was precise and carried the weight of an offering rather than a suggestion. The strategist. His word was Japanese, or something older than what she thought of as Japanese, from a century in a dialect she couldn't place. It was short, 2 syllables. It had the quality of a name, a proper noun, a clan name, she thought, something specific, something that belonged to someone who was gone, his way of carrying it forward. She wrote it down and felt the weight of it on the display. That one wasn't a suggestion, it was a gift. The difference was in the silence after, the way the intercom held nothing for a long moment, as if he'd said what he had to say, and the channel itself understood that no follow-up was required. Then, and she knew this voice before the first syllable resolved, because this voice was always awake at 0300, because this voice did not sleep heavily, because this voice had spent a lifetime listening through walls and doors and the thin barriers between safety and its absence. Then, the word we use for the road when you have been on it so long you have stopped thinking about the destination, the Romani woman said. Her voice was warm and measured and came through the intercom, like it had been waiting in the circuit for exactly this moment. Just the road, just moving. The word she gave was Romani. It was beautiful. It sounded like something you'd say to yourself on the 3rd day of walking, when your feet had stopped complaining and your body had accepted that forward was the only available direction, and the road had become so familiar it was no longer a road. It was just the shape your life was making. Dika wrote it down. Her throat was tight. She didn't know why. It was 0300, and she was writing words on the display, and none of this was supposed to be emotional. She was doing a transponder change. It was an administrative task. She was a systems engineer performing a routine registry update on a stolen alien freight vessel, and the fact that her eyes were stinging was probably the sodium orange lighting, which was not designed for human eyes and had been giving her low-grade headaches since day one. That was definitely what it was, the lighting. The last voice came in Nahuatl. She knew it was the last because she'd been counting, and she knew it was him because his voice carried that unhurried, ceremonial quality, as if every word he spoke was being said for the first time and also the last time, and both of those things were the same thing. It did not preface the word. It did not explain it. He spoke it the way you place a stone on a cairn, deliberately, with the understanding that it would remain. The word he gave was a color, or a time, or both. Nahuatl didn't separate them the way her languages did. It was the word for a specific quality of morning light, the kind that came before the world knew the sun was rising, when the sky held itself between dark and bright and everything was possible because nothing had been decided yet. She wrote it down. 6 answers, 6 languages. None of them agree. All of them are right. I am going to make something that is made of all of them and belongs to none of them. She looked at the display, 6 words in 6 scripts, transliterated into the blocky letters of her phonetic approximation. She read them again. She read them a 3rd time. She said them out loud, quietly, one after another, listening to the sounds they made in her mouth, the hard Norse compound, the clean Latin phrase, the rolling Comanche, the precise Japanese, the warm Romani, the luminous Nahuatl. Each one sat in a different part of her jaw, her tongue, her teeth. The Norse was all consonants and force. The Romani was vowels and forward motion. The Nahuatl sat high behind her front teeth, like light. That is also an accurate description of this ship. She started working. She'd done too much thinking in 8 days, and it had gotten her exactly as far as sitting alone at 0300 with a blank field and a blinking cursor. She let her ear do it instead. She took the opening consonant cluster from the strategist clan name, the sound that carried the weight of something preserved past its expected ending. She took the middle vowel from the Romani road word, the open, moving sound, the sound of a foot still falling. She took a closing syllable that blended the Norse hardness with something softer, something that didn't exist in any of the 6 languages, but existed in the space between them. She wrote it out, looked at it, said it, Arveth. It didn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything in any language that had ever been spoken on Earth or anywhere else. It was a synthesis, a word made by someone who knew 6 words and belonged to none of them, built from pieces that each carried a meaning she could feel but not translate. It sounded like a name. It sounded like it had always been a name, and she'd just found it, the way you find a stone on a beach that fits exactly in your palm and realize you'd been walking with your hand open for a reason. She typed it into the field. The display asked for confirmation. She confirmed. The transponder system, the same mature, stagnant, idiot-proof combine technology that had been broadcasting the ship's old identity since before she was born, accepted the new name without comment. No validation error. No flag. No query. The system did not care what the ship was called. It was a text field. It took the text. The broadcast updated. She watched the confirmation pulse go out, a tight beam packet, to the nearest relay, which would log it and propagate it forward, and from there it would ripple outward through the Combine's automated navigation network at the speed of light plus, reaching station after station, each one dutifully updating its local database with a new entry, independent trader Arvith, no prior record, no flag, no file. The Combine doesn't have this name. No database on any Combine station will return a record for it. We are, for the first time, something they have no file on. The weight of that settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. For 8 days they had been a stolen Combine ship, broadcasting a Combine identity, running on Combine fuel, eating Combine food, breathing Combine air. For 8 days they had been a line item in someone's recovery manifest, a freight anomaly, a procedural irregularity, cargo that had become non-compliant. The Combine's language, for what they were, had been the only language available because it was the only language the ship spoke. Not anymore. The ship spoke their language now, or rather it spoke a language that didn't exist until 60 seconds ago, a language made of 6 words from 6 worlds by a woman sitting alone at an engineering station at 0300 because she'd understood, in the way that comes from being pulled out of one life and dropped into another, that the most dangerous thing you can be in a universe run by people who file everything is something that has never been filed. She leaned back in the adjusted chair. The lumbar support crinkled, the nutrient slab wrapper shifting under her weight, making the sound of compressed foil that she had heard so many times now it had become part of the bridge's ambient signature, as familiar as the reactor hum or the thermal exchanger's warble. The bridge was quiet. The displays glowed their steady sodium orange, the Combine's industrial palette, the only light she'd known for 8 days. Somewhere behind her, in the corridors and converted bays and maintenance alcoves, 600 people were sleeping. Some of them had names she knew. Most of them had names she didn't. All of them were on a ship that had, 60 seconds ago, become something new. She pulled up the star chart. The avoided cluster was 2 days ahead, a smudge of 40-odd stars on the chart's edge, marked with Combine avoidance notations and 4 dead-end entry markers that the tracker had read like animal tracks. Ormasealth that none came out. The Combine had looked at that data and decided the rational response was to stop going in. The tracker had looked at the same data and decided the rational response was to go in faster. Decca had spent the last 2 days annotating the chart. She didn't have the data for the full thing, and wouldn't until they were closer, but she'd marked the parts she could see. She'd marked the stars they'd passed. She'd noted the relay stations they'd pinged and the ones they'd avoided. She'd flagged the fuel density readings that suggested a star had harvestable resources and the magnetic field readings that suggested another one was unstable. She'd written notes to herself in English, practical shorthand from a woman who had spent 3 years writing field reports for NGOs and knew that the difference between useful information and useless information was whether you could find it again at 0300 when you were tired and scared and needed to make a decision. The chart was hers now. She'd overlaid her annotations on their data, and the result was a map that spoke 2 languages, theirs, in the cold geometry of navigation beacons and threat assessments, and hers, in the messy handwriting of someone who was learning the sky 1 star at a time. She looked at it for a long time. 8 days ago, she'd sat at this same station, different chair position, different display configuration, different everything, and looked at a galaxy she didn't know. She'd felt the size of it, like a physical pressure, the way you feel altitude when you climb too fast. And this star was unknown. Every direction was a guess. The Combine's chart had been the only map, and it was a map that didn't include the place she'd come from, because Earth was Tier 7 negligible, and the cartography department hadn't seen a reason to maintain the entry. Now she looked at the same chart, and some of the stars had her writing beside them, a handful. Enough that the chart was no longer entirely alien. It was partly annotated, partly known, partly hers in a way that felt like the difference between standing in a city you've never visited and standing in one where you know the name of one street. One street was enough. One street meant you could find the next one. The fuel readout pulsed gently in the corner of her display, a slow amber heartbeat counting down the reactor's current cycle. She checked it by habit. Nominal. The thermal exchanger warbled once, settled. The life support indicators, the ones she'd recalibrated on day 4 to account for human respiratory needs rather than whatever the Combine's original crew had been breathing, showed green across all inhabited sections. Air was good, temperature was good. Water reclamation was running at 87%, which was not great, but was better than the 71% she'd inherited and miles better than the 53% that would trigger the emergency protocols she'd spent an entire afternoon learning how to override. But the ship was running, The ship was hers, the ship was theirs, and in 2 days it would reach the edge of a cluster of stars that the largest bureaucratic empire in this arm of the galaxy had decided to avoid, and what they found there would be, she didn't know. She didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. None of them did. But the ship had a name, and the name was broadcasting. And the name was made of 6 words from 6 worlds, and belonged to none of them and all of them. And that was exactly what they were, a thing that had never been filed, heading toward a place that had never been mapped, crewed by people who had never been meant to meet. Dika adjusted the lumbar support one more time. The wrapper crinkled up. She pulled up her annotation layer and added a new note beside the avoided cluster. 2 days, bring everybody. Then she settled in to read the stars. Behind her, the ship breathed. The corridors hummed their steady frequency. 600 people slept in various states of having survived, something scattered through converted containment bays and maintenance alcoves and the warm spaces between bulkheads where the reactor's heat bled through the walls. Some of them dreamed, some of them didn't. All of them were carried forward through a sky that was no longer entirely unknown, on a heading that was no longer a flight, but a direction, in a ship that had a name. The transponder pulsed. The Arveth, independent trader, no prior record, no flag, no file, announced itself to the void. The void received the announcement without comment, the way it received everything, and the signal propagated outward through the Combi's automated relay network, station by station, each one logging the entry and moving on, because automated relay stations did not have opinions, and the name Arveth meant nothing to them, and nothing to anyone, and nothing to any system, in any database anywhere. Which was exactly the point. The stars moved. The ship moved. The woman at the navigation console watched them both, annotating as she went, learning the sky one mark at a time. She was looking at a chart she was building. That was everything. 8 days and 600 lives, and a transponder change at 0300, and 6 words in 6 languages, and a name that had never existed before she typed it. The Arveth flew on. Dika read the stars.